This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, and we're going to do some pretty fun stuff today. One of the things that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a couple of videos that I'm going to give a quick little bit of a review that'll be rather amusing. And I also am inviting other people on. If anyone's interested in joining me on this chat, you're welcome to come in. That's why I call it a free-for-all. So it's free for everybody to join in. And so that's a good deal. So I'm first going to show you something I found actually quite amusing. And it was in a video with T-Jump. And so I'm going to, without further ado, I'm just going to turn over to that in just a moment here. So let me just bring that up. I've had quite a few internet issues today. My internet's been up and down and very choppy. So I just hope I'm able to make this video. I want to say thanks to John Lloyd. That's a very nice suggestion. I do have that, but I don't even, it's through my email, I believe, my sjthomason@gmail email, but you don't have to worry about that right now. But we're going to talk about something pretty funny here as soon as I can get to it. Hold on one second. Okay. So this is T-Jump, and it was in a video called with Ask Yourself. It says, does T-Jump's moral theory suck? So it's a little bit amusing. So we're going to go and take a look at that just to start here. So let me just share my screen so we can get that so you can see this. We're just going to watch one little glimpse of this video. So share computer sound. All right, so here we go. And again, I will open this up for other people if you'd like to join me. But right now, let's just set this up. So we're looking at T-Jump's moral theory. He's talking to Ask Yourself. Ask Yourself is apparently a very young gentleman. I believe he might even be either prior to college or about to go off to college. So he's very young, up against T-Jump. And so here's what they have to say. So let's listen.
In a sense, I'm agreeing with him. I don't think it's illegitimate to cite, what did he say, Stanford or IAP? Like
Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah, it's a philosophy encyclopedia. It's a pretty reasonable source.
You know, it's just Ask Yourself brings up an irrelevant point of wanting to form an argument in his strict sense. It just doesn't make any difference to my position at all. So I'm still right, even if I don't put it as a valid argument. I don't even need one because it can be phrased in a valid argument.
See, this is very funny. So he says he's still right. He doesn't even need a valid argument. So let's see if he comes up with a valid argument. So this is just for, giggles here.
Well, just to be clear, I don't, as you will notice if you play this back, I don't start a conversation by, insisting someone formalize their argument. But if I ask for the argument repeatedly, where I want to see how you're getting from using a certain mouth sound to refer to impositions on will to error theory being false, and it's not clear what the inference is. After asking a certain amount of times, I do ask for something formal. And even at that point, I'm very fair. I understand that I might not be talking to someone who's comfortable with logic. And I'm no kind of logic whiz. I'm comfortable with propositional logic, basic level first order logic. So if it reaches that point where the inference, hasn't been clarified and I want it to be clarified formally, I'll just get them to spell out premises and conclusion as best they can. And if they can't make it, formally valid, that's fine. I'll help them do so. But if they try to make the move of insisting it's valid when it obviously isn't, and they can't specify the form in any formal language, and they refuse to do so, then I might laugh a bit. So, yeah.
But your argument's just idiotic. Like my argument is so simple.
I didn't make an argument. I'm
what you're saying, everything you're saying is so stupid. That's what it is. So like a horse is a thing with hooves. X does not have hooves. F is not a horse.
Okay, so did you hear that? A horse is a thing with hooves. X does not have hooves. Therefore, X is not a horse. Now let's take this to its logical application here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to the chat here. Let's take this because I found this really incredibly amusing because it of course made me think of something very logical. So is that saying that a horse that happens to be born without, with some sort of birth defects that maybe doesn't come in with hooves or even legs or anything like that, does that mean it's not a horse? No, of course not. That doesn't mean it's a horse. If you're born without a hand or without a foot, does it mean you're not a person? No, this is not a logical argument. And so it's kind of the most hilarious thing that it's in a video on theory, T-Jump's logic. So it's really interesting. So I want to say thank you, John Lloyd, for the super chat, and Jesse Camping and Susan. I see you guys all in here. If you're interested in coming in here, I'm actually just going to post the link right in the chat. And if you feel like being coming in here and chatting with me, joining me here, and we'll have a nice conversation. I'm going to open it up. Let me just figure out where the chat, there we go. There's my share link, and I am copy invite link. All right, here we go. Coming back to the chat. I want to say some interesting things that I've been reading about lately, actually also. Okay, so here is the shareable link. If you guys, anyone's interested, you can feel free to join me. So here's the bottom line. Here's the bottom line. So there's some very interesting things that are going on right now in politics, right now with our government. There's all kinds of different things. And I think that a lot of us have divergent views. A lot of us are having different views on this sort of thing. And so it's a good idea to talk about these different views and these divergences. And I see we've got Christian Watkins. I'm going to let Christian Watkins in. I don't know Christian. Hello, Christian.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Is my mic quality good? Does that seem solid? Or?
Seems really good.
Okay, awesome. I know that we had connected before on Twitter for a potential conversation later in the year, but I saw the free for all title and I was like, I gotta come in and say hello because I've heard so much about you, and I watch pretty much all your videos, and it's a lot of fun to finally talk to you.
Oh, well, thank you. That's really great. So I'm glad that we've connected before, and I'm really appreciative that you've watched my videos. I know some of them aren't the highest quality. I know my content. I think my content is halfway decent, but sometimes the delivery is lacking. I need to get
no, absolutely. No, you're totally fine. I enjoy it, even though I find disagreement. I certainly enjoy the way you present it, and I think it's just a disagreement of ideas, and that's totally fine to me. Good.
So what ideas do we disagree on?
Well, I'm an atheist, so that might start it.
Okay, yeah, we definitely disagree there.
Yeah, I would say that that's probably the first place we would disagree. I'm not sure if you want to engage there or move on to other things we disagree on, or.
No, I mean, it would just be interesting to find. I find that here's what I've been finding. I find that most atheists tend to be, at least the ones that I've spoken with, most of them are males. They tend to be males. Most of them are younger in general, if you look at the average age maybe of atheists, and most of them tend to be left-leaning. And so I'm curious, are you left-leaning?
I am younger, male, and left-leaning. So
okay, yeah, you fit the
very apt analysis. Very apt analysis there.
Yeah, so that's what I'm finding. And so here's what it is. I've been looking at, there's some interesting things going on right now with our politics, and one of the things that I found is an atheist, Jonathan Haidt, he's written a bunch of things called moral foundations theory, and he's distinguished people who lean more liberally versus conservatives on different dimensions. And in that, it speaks to this idea of, say, Trump versus Biden, and the appeal for Trump to patriotism, which is completely in line with the values that people on the conservative side tend to hold. And then the appeal with Biden to care and fairness, which is completely in line with what people on the left tend to favor. And so this is going to be a really interesting political thing coming up, because you see that Trump was doing this at 4th of July with some of his strategies over there at Mount Rushmore and the flags and all that stuff.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that, Trump's 2016 campaign was, the country's broken and it needs fixing. That was mainly the tenor of his 2016 campaign. But in the 2020 campaign, it seems to me to be the case that he's focusing more on America's great and we need to protect the greatness of America. It's a really interesting twist on the traditional conservative and liberal dynamic.
It is. And I think his strategy is to focus on this idea of order over chaos. I think he's trying to appeal to he wants to make the case. And now I'm an independent, so I have not chosen my politician for this coming election yet. But I want to say that, and I don't even know if it's going to be either Trump or Biden. I don't know. I might vote for Kanye West.
That would be a fun endeavor, I would say.
Yeah, who knows? I might just do that. Well, but I don't know who am I going to vote for. But anyway, but what I want to see is what he's doing right now is he wants to shape the Republican Party as if the party is the one of order, and and then he wants to shape the Democrat Party as if it's the one of chaos. And he's pointing to examples like in New York City, where it looks like their crime rates have gone up over 100% in June since the cops have been the funding has been reduced. And so it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'm wondering. I'm wondering how well Trump's case is going to work, because in 2016, Miss Secretary Clinton made the case that America is already great and we're just trying to make some minor improvements, and that was kind of the tenor of her campaign. But she lost pretty spectacularly in the Electoral College, which shows me that a message that is designed for order and designed for America's already great may not be palatable to a generation millennial and Generation Z, which doesn't seem to like very much about what America is actually founded on. So
yeah, and so I bet you and I also must differ on something that I have. I was going to just watch this video. I was going to watch this video with Vaush and Sargon of Akkad on capitalism and socialism.
I have seen that. That is always a fun conversation with Vaush. But
oh my gosh. Well, do you agree with Vaush's position? Are you kind of that far left leaning, or?
I'm pretty much more of a moderate liberal. I think Vaush. I have a lot of criticisms of what Vaush says, but I also have an equal amount of criticisms for Sargon. So I wouldn't say that I'm a hard lefty. I don't necessarily take the farthest left position, but I certainly would consider myself more on the left axiomatically, because I am more in favor of equality. I'm anti-religion in general, but that would put me more on the left of the spectrum compared to a more traditionalist right-wing conservative fundamentalist viewpoint. But I would say I'm not a socialist. I don't believe in the socialization of labor. I'm not that far left, but I certainly am traditionally on the left side of the aisle.
Okay, good. Well, I can understand that position. I appreciate that position, because I at some point, to some extent, I think, oh, well, socialism, if we could have universal health care, I've been voting for Democrats typically because of universal health care. It's been something that I'm passionate about, even though I have perfectly good health care with my employer. I've always felt that it's just sort of a human right. And so that would speak to something more socialist. But then and I also, of course, love the fact that our free education, I love our school system. I'm a big fan of the K through 12. I moved to a neighborhood purposely because I wanted to be in a school district, an A-rated school district. And so that's why I'm here. And I can definitely get behind environmental causes and trying to figure out what's going on with global climate change and that sort of thing. And so I think we're probably on the same page on a lot of stuff with that.
Yeah, I mean, everything you just said are policies that I support pretty vehemently. So I think that that's awesome that despite perhaps a more right-wing leaning, you have at least some values that don't align with the orthodoxy, which is always a good sign of someone who's thinking openly and honestly.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like we need a third political party because I love all that stuff I just mentioned, but I'm also, on the other hand, I would call myself a capitalist. In a lot of ways, I love the idea of business. I teach business courses, that you probably know that. And so I'm very much in favor of entrepreneurship, innovation, creativity. And I tend to think the Republicans lean more that way. And so I see a benefit. And I'm also not happy with the way that the leanings have gone with respect to the abortion issue. And so
I believe you're pro-life, are you not?
Yeah, I'm pro-life. And so.
See, I'm temperamentally pro-choice, I would say.
Okay, yeah. And so I've gotten into, in fact, it's going to be kind of funny. So this weekend I'm debating somebody on objective morality and whether or not it's grounded in God. And that's going to be on the Modern Day Debate channel on Sunday, I believe.
Oh, I just had a conversation with Dean Meadow on a call-in show last night. Dean Meadows about objective and subjective morality. We had a 30-minute hash out. He and I are going to have a long form debate hopefully here soon. But
good. Now, how do I know? I feel like I know that name, Dean Meadows. Is he an atheist too?
No, he's a pretty well-known Christian apologist, at least in the Facebook circles. He's
okay.
I want to say he studied under Dr. Craig. I want to say is what his education background is. But yeah, we had a discussion on a show last night for about 30 minutes about that morality issue, and I had a lot of fun. But
so, what's your take? Is your take that we have objective morality, or are you a relativist?
I think that every moral system is necessarily subjective.
Okay, so that's interesting. So, so that's where we differ.
Sure, yeah. I would say that. So
I'm a moral realist.
I usually bring in axiomatic principles. Like, for example, one axiomatic principle for religious folks is the fact that the Bible is true. It's an axiomatic principle. If you agree with it, then you can access a whole bunch of propositions that are objectively true. But in order to access those principles, you would have to agree on the axiomatic validity of those principles. So what I would say is, in general, you have a debate that I think is improperly formed, which is, if we can agree on certain axiomatic principles, we can come to pseudo-objective statements on what should be considered. but those axiomatic principles necessitate a subjective assessment of the evidence, and that's where I would say that all moral systems require a subjective assessment and acceptance of axioms.
See, I wouldn't say that. Here's my opinion. I feel like we have been slowly discovering what's been embedded in our conscience. And I think that over the past 2,000 years, if we've looked at the way that Christianity has evolved and the way that it's changed societies, and to the point where suddenly in 1776, our founding fathers say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally, that we desire justice, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Those sorts of things to me are axiomatic and not subject to the whims or opinions of any one culture, generation, or people. And so being that that's transcendent to these populations, and no matter what anyone's opinion of it, we still have these axiomatic truths. And so I would make a pretty good claim that the
oh, sure. I mean, I understand what. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. That's my bad. I wanted to kind of jump in there because I don't want to forget what you said, which is I think it's so if, like, for example, someone were to say, I'm religious and I think there's certain transcendental moral traits that we can demonstrate are objective, independent of minds accepting them. So it's like, to make that argument, what is the delineation between you saying that as a theist calling to God and like a secular person calling to axiomatic objectivity through philosophical naturalism? Like, what is the difference between you saying something is true independent of minds because I'm calling on a God, and someone saying something is true independent of minds because I'm calling on a naturalistic law?
Okay, see, what I don't think that naturalism can explain it. And I didn't say it's independent of a mind. I said it's stance independent. So the way that they the way that they define objective morality in the literature, in the academic literature, is it's stance independent, not mind independent. So it doesn't matter what your position is about whether or not truth exists. Does truth exist? And of course, truth does exist, and it exists not as a function of any one of our opinions. We have certain facts out there that exist, and it doesn't matter what our opinion or our subjective views of those facts.
Are you using comports to reality truth? Are you using the comports to reality definition of truth, or what truth are you using?
I'm just saying truth, basically the something that conforms to reality. I could say it like that.
Okay, awesome. I would agree that in fact exists.
Okay, good. So we have one agreement, and
Yeah,
that might be the easiest one. That probably is the easiest one to agree on, because there's a lot of other things that people are going to say, well, that's an independent thing, or if I say justice, for example, somebody might have a different take on what's justice versus another person, but that's of course an epistemological position, not an ontological position. So I'm just looking at the ontological truths, the foundations, and that sort of thing. Whether or not these truths exist, whether or not the value of life exists, whether or not that sort of thing. So that's my main view, whether or not we have objective moral values and duties, if you'd say.
Sure. Out of curiosity, I'm aware that you're a Christian. Do you generally have a scriptural based morality, or more of I have an intuition of what is right and wrong, and that must come from God, and if the Bible contradicts that, I can use my intuition over the Bible, or what is kind of your viewpoint on that?
That's a good question. I've read a lot on moral intuitions theory. I've read a little bit about reasoning and different ways that we come to God. My belief is that in what they call Christian synderesis, and this is this idea of a conscience, essentially. And so it's basically saying, if I'm trying to figure out if something's good, if it's right, I look at what is my conscience telling me? And a lot of times that doesn't go in line with your intuitions. Like, for example, I think you might have heard my analogy before, but I said, what if I'm standing at the end of a pond and I see a little boy and an alligator lurches out at the little boy? My natural intuition is to save my life and run. But my conscience wouldn't let me do that. My conscience would say, no, go save the boy, sacrifice yourself. And so something like that, I think, is it's inner proof that there's a moral lawgiver within us that's sort of guiding us to do things that sometimes are self-sacrificing.
I guess what do you mean by consciousness? Because, or sorry, not consciousness, conscience. Because, for example, when we have certain reactions to certain situations, could you not argue that there's a primary reaction based on biological instincts, but there's a secondary reaction based on sociocultural impacts that may conflict with our biological instinct, but they may take over? I'm just not sure how we get to a conscience from something that at least I think could be potentially adequately explained through naturalism.
Okay. Yeah. See, I just don't think naturalism can explain a lot of our human experience. And so I would just...
What about that specific one, though? The consciousness or the conscious claim?
Well, I think that you can certainly say that our intuitions and our reasoning, possibly, we've evolved those socially within social settings and that sort of thing. But I think the conscience idea is something that goes beyond us. I think that that's something that speaks to God. The idea that we have shame and guilt after we do the wrong things, or that we have to, if you see people who are, say, murdering other populations, they're doing the wrong thing. If you saw what Hitler did, to be able to justify in the minds of the the German people what he was doing, he had to dehumanize Jewish people and pretend like they were rats, so that people didn't realize that because they knew what they were doing was wrong, but they were able to justify it in their minds by pretending the population was something other than it is.
Do you think there's any truth to the claim that Adolf Hitler would frequently use scriptural motivations in his rhetoric? I'm not saying it's the fault of Christianity. I wouldn't, I'm not that angry of an atheist, but I guess I'm more just curious. Like, do you think there is a case to be made that Hitler had at least a scriptural rhetoric to his words that may have been at least that he used it, not that it was true or accurate, but that he used it?
Well, he's a clever politician. That's what they do. And so, I mean, Trump does that now. Trump holds up the Bible and it's signaling to the populace. If you know that you're speaking to a Christian populace, of course, you want to appeal to things that they hold to be self-evident or they hold to be true. And so if you've got, around 80% of our population are Christians, or 75 to 80% of the population in the United States is Christian. And maybe whether or not they're following very closely or that sort of thing, we've still got a big, heavy portion of Christians. And he knows in his base, a lot of Christian conservatives are operating. And so he holds up the Bible to signal to us. And does that mean I think that Trump is the best example? Is Jesus like? No.
I would hope not. Yeah.
He's about the opposite of what Jesus is like. And so but I see him, I think you could apply that to, I'm trying to say like Trump is like Hitler, but Hitler was appealing to a Christian populace. And so he was using terms that they're familiar with. Let me get into that for a second, because something that you said reminded me of something that I was thinking about. There's a country called Kiribati. It's in the South Pacific. And it's an island system of a bunch of islands, and many of them are low-level islands. And because of what's going on with climate change, the sea level's been rising, and it's overtaken some of the islands, forcing some of its inhabitants to come to the major island of Tarawa, which is the capital. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I was looking at my students, and I was telling my students, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? We're talking about change management in one of my classes. I say, how are we going to solve this problem? What are you going to do? How are you going to create a sense of urgency? Who are you going to form in your coalition? I'm using the steps of Cotter's change management principles. And the idea, who do you put in your coalition when you are trying to appeal to a population, is you're looking at the influencers. And on that island, these people actually believe, they believe that God is not going to flood the world again. And to them, their world would be flooded if the islands were sinking. So a lot of them are just hanging around while the islands are sort of being gobbled up under the ocean, thinking that God's not going to do that because he promised after Noah that he wasn't going to flood the world again. So they don't have anything to worry about. They don't have to leave there. That's what a lot of them think. And so if I'm going to try to convince those people that their view is incorrect, that's very likely that Tarawa might one day go under, I would have to use the Bible in some ways. I would have to go back to the Bible and use verses to get them out of that belief system. I can't use non-biblical verses to appeal to people who have a biblical belief in something quite specific. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, absolutely. I totally correct. I think that there's at least a certain historical context to the fact that a lot of leaders, or just people who are trying to convince people in general, will appeal to a commonly held standard of the time. And you can see that, for example, in the Roman Empire, when they appeal to democratic values in the presence of dissent. So there's a lot of historical precedent for what you're saying. I don't really disagree at all. I think it's really well made point.
Yeah, and that was just something that, because I've been kind of just paying a lot of attention to politicians and what they've been doing, especially now, because we all are, and we're home a lot. And my husband has the news on all the time, which really, I actually heard something that said, if you listen to the news over 4 hours a day, you're more likely to be depressed. And I thought, well, of course, this news is horrible. It's the worst news ever. There's not a day that goes by that I get some, and they don't talk about any good news. It's always the bad stuff too. So how are you faring with COVID?
I'm doing pretty well. I've been doing a good job of self-isolating. I would generally say, I had one of my friends tell me something hilarious where they said, if you were to find out tomorrow that there is an active volcano that was going to erupt, you wouldn't even blink an eye because of how crazy 2020 has been. And it's one of those things where the news cycle is so constantly monotonous and depressing. And I'm trying to stick myself into these, important religious conversations just because of how the world is so tragically bound by these processes today. So religion, to me, at least, these conversations, theology debates, things like that, are a bit of an escape from the day-to-day news cycle of, are we going to hit 4 million cases? Are we going to hit 5 million cases? It's nice to talk about, the teleological argument or something like that for a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with you. I had to break away. I haven't been on because I've been entertaining relatives this past weekend, and prior to that I was teaching classes, and so I've been pretty quiet from the YouTube channel. And so today I thought I got to get back onto that because I get in a good mood after I get off these things. So that's always helpful. So
oh yeah,
usually,
I would.
usually in a good mood.
I'm still very new to this whole debates and conversations thing, but even from the limited time that I've had the pleasure of being on with people, it's been just a bunch of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to say hi to the people in the chat. I'm going to put this link out there again. If anyone else wants to join us, you guys are welcome to. I've got the link right in the chat. I know it's quite brave because who knows who might come in.
I was going to say that's an exceptionally bold move considering the typical viewership for YouTube, but.
Well, also considering my typical viewers, I've made a lot of enemies.
I would imagine so. I mean, you take I think both of us take controversial positions, at least to both other sides. So
yeah. I mean, I have controversial positions on a lot of. Well, I go into. Let me ask you this: were you raised a Christian? Because I noticed your name is Christian, so that's kind of your parents must have decided on something.
My mom actually just liked the name in general, but I was in fact raised a Lutheran for 16 and a half years.
Okay, so 16 and a half years, and then you decided at 16 or so that you were not going to believe in God anymore.
Yes, sort of when I started edging towards 17. I'm only 18 right now, but
okay.
I was I moved from kind of a sort of fundamentalist creationist sort of type Christian to what I would now consider myself to be just your kind of standard atheist who's interested in philosophy, interested in the conversation. And I generally became unconvinced that the world had any gods in it or any god or gods in it. So, and I should just clarify, a lot of atheists will say, atheism is just the position that, there's a lack of belief in God. I guess I understand where that comes from, and I'll even argue for it sometimes. I'm totally willing to say my worldview exists independent of God's, and that is an assertion that I'm making. It's what I believe to be true, and I'm not necessarily interested in some of the weasel work that I think occurs when people say, atheism is just a rejection of a claim, which perhaps it could be to some people, but what atheism means to me is existing in a world where there's no good evidence for the God claim.
Okay. That's and your age actually, it gives me a lot of hope because I just know when people go off to college a lot of time, and I'm assuming you're either in college or maybe you're going to go to college at some point, or is that?
Yeah, evolutionary biology degree.
Okay. Yeah, that's another thing. I've also noticed a lot of atheists want to go into evolutionary biology. I've
actually wanted to be a biologist since I was little. I've actually wanted to be a biologist since I was little because I've always been fascinated with animals.
Okay.
And I guess, sure, it'll be nice to have some extra knowledge in biological studies when it comes to debating people on religion, but it's also just a passion of mine, independent from my atheism. But
okay, that's fair enough. So, but I think that I do have. I mean, there are a lot of cases of people when they go away to college, they might lose their faith and then come back to it maybe in their 20s. I actually, in my mid 20s, I started questioning Christianity. I started questioning whether Jesus resurrected, and I was a very wishy-washy Christian for about 20 years. So for a long time, a very wishy-washy. And then I felt like I started having some spiritual experiences, and God really opened my eyes. And so that's what brought me back. But I'm curious, if one day, say you wake up in the morning and Jesus Christ appeared to you, would you be willing to take it all back?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's fair. So you're that kind of atheist. So I think that's an open-minded atheist.
Yeah, I'm while I do love Matt Dillahunty, I think his answer on that question is absolutely ridiculous. That he wouldn't take that as evidence for Jesus' existence. Like, sure, you could make the skeptical argument that how do you know it's Jesus? But provided that it's actually Jesus and he actually appears to me, that's a significant amount of evidence in favor of the worldview of Christianity.
Okay, good. Yeah, so that's a good thing to know. So I think that it'll be good when you start doing the investigations. And so one day you'll want to know is there a greater purpose, meaning, all that kind of stuff in life. And as you do that looking and you ask for the truth, I think the truth will present itself to you, which is what happened to me. And so
Hey, if I'm wrong, I want to be proven wrong, because there's nothing more satisfying to me than learning something new that I can claim as true and testing that out with people who may disagree. And I want to come to the end of my life with saying that I did everything I possibly could to hold the most honest positions possible. And if that means atheism, it means atheism. And if that means Christianity or Islam or whatever, that's what it means.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And so, yeah, and I've looked into, I think when you do your investigations and you due diligence, I spent a lot of time looking at the Eastern faiths and thinking they were pretty great. But then I kind of realized, after learning about things like the Big Bang and that sort of thing, and Eastern philosophies, that the world is constantly just in this recycle mode instead of having the start date that is pointed out with the Big Bang. And then I look at the Muslim faith and how Allah is transcendent to the universe, but not immanent within it. And so I look at Christianity as the situation where life is best explained. So our universe, its beginnings, all of this kind of stuff is evidenced in Christianity. And so, and it's the one religion of all these major religions where God himself came down to the earth and resurrected for us. And I think when you look for the evidence of the resurrection, you're going to find it's really compelling. There's a lot of stuff, even extra biblically, that give us support. So.
Well, lucky for you, I own just about 27 Bibles. I own just an absolute massive amount of them. I read them all the time. I've been going recently through John, and I love reading the Bible, regardless of if it's true, because I think it has a lot of utility outside of perhaps the actual inherent truth of it. And I find that the more I know about the Bible, the more I can interact with Christians and get some answers that I may be seeking. But out of curiosity, kind of outside that point, would you kind of accept the general idea that there could be a best explanation for something, but we're looking for the sufficient explanation?
No, I definitely think we're looking for the best explanation for life, essentially.
Well, like,
And
so
but people
kind of
do accept, there are some people who would accept a merely sufficient explanation.
So I guess I should more clarify my terms. That's kind of bad on my part. But so, for example, the best explanation for an issue may and perhaps be a poor explanation. Like I'll throw this hypothetical at you. If there was Islam and atheism, and those were the only two worldviews available in the world, would you say that the best explanation of those two worldviews would still be not sufficient?
Yeah, they wouldn't be sufficient because they don't explain a lot of things in life. I think the whole idea of Jesus bearing his cross gives us a lot of explanation for life's hardships. And I don't think that the Muslim faith, which is all about practices and earning your way to God, is a good stance as far as what God really is and what he really did for us and why he did it. I mean, you think about why on Calvary did he perfectly reconcile God's perfect justice with his perfect mercy and love? And so he did that by being the one who paid the price. God can exercise his justice because Jesus paid the price for our sins. And so he was able to forgive us concurrently with also having somebody pay the price, which wasn't us. So Jesus basically opened the doors to heaven for us. And that itself, to me, is so compelling with life and explaining life that I would look at that and I would think the Muslim faith I don't know that much about the Muslim faith, but what I do know, what little I know from watching people like David Wood, is the Quran itself. There's just a lot in there. Women are half brains. I mean, sorry, but I actually have seen the studies. Women and men have average IQs of 100.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry,
the
folks,
IQs are like precisely the same. I guess just kind of to get back to what I was saying, I'm obviously we disagree on some of the specifics about the Bible, but it's not really relevant to get into here. I guess what I would say is, regardless of the actual worldview, like if Islam and atheism were the only two, tangible worldviews, could we at least acknowledge that perhaps the best explanation for something is not necessarily sufficient? It provides a holistic worldview.
Okay, well, I guess if we went back to, and I actually wouldn't use Muslim and see, what I would do is, if we wanted to be realistic about this, let's think about how life would have been, say, 5,000 years ago. So if we go back to that point 5,000 years ago, when people are looking at the stars and the sun and worshiping those, or worshiping trees, or doing these different things that pagans were worshiping, they were worshiping all of these different gods. We didn't have, Judaism, Christianity, all of this kind of stuff had not come about. Muslim faith hadn't come about, but we did have some sort of pagan sort of faiths back then. And so you think to yourself, well, what was for those people? What was their best explanation? Well, the best explanation for them is there is a higher power there's something beyond us. But to them, they had embedded that power in the earth because they thought the earth was flat and basically the center of everything. And so, so at that point, maybe those sorts of gods were the best explanation and a sufficient explanation for them. But as we go later on into this day and age, I would say that we have to look for a much more robust explanation.
So I guess what you would say is, with the information you have available, come to the best explanation, but don't stop trying to make it sufficient in all corners of the worldview.
Well, I would say keep learning, keep learning about your position and why you're taking the position, and be critical. I mean, be critical of whatever you're studying. And so that's one of the things when you come upon a hurdle and you say, well, wait a second. Like, for example, when I'm debating people like Schuyler Fiction, who loves to go into the Bible and look at the Old Testament and point out slavery in the Bible and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, your God did this, your God did that. Why did your God kill the babies in 1 Samuel 15? I mean, this is the kind of thing I have to deal with. And I say, okay, well, how do I reconcile that? How do I reconcile loving God doing that sort of thing? And I have to look back and I have to do some deep diving studies and find out what exactly was life in those ancient times and why was it ordered in such a way? And some of the answers actually are really stunning that I've been studying lately from Michael Heiser in the Bible. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yeah, I would say, so this is probably not the traditional atheist position, but as far as people who make, the argument, God is evil in the Bible or whatever, I basically look at it this way. My question is, does God exist? Not is God moral or is God good? So I can have that discussion kind of independently from the theological debates, but when someone, brings up, the argument from present evil in the world, I kind of just roll my eyes because yes, I find objections to the God in the Bible, but that does nothing to get us closer to whether or not the God of the Bible exists or whether or not we can demonstrate that.
Yeah. And you also have to look at the context, the ancient context back then. God was the leader, the theological leader of Israel. If you look at Psalm 82, which is really interesting, and I had never looked at this before, but he basically ordained many of the sons of God, these spiritual beings, to be overseeing these and authorities in all of these other places aside from Israel. And so when you think about that, there's spiritual beings basically still existing in this world, and they're at all different levels that we can see from the book of Hebrews and Ephesians. And it's crazy. So it's like, it actually, to me, explains a lot of things. It explains why people have multiple gods in their minds, why people in India right now have all these gods that they believe in, is because there probably are spiritual presences in India that are influencing those people, but they're not the most high. So.
I'm curious, how would you differentiate between, so one of the things that I find compelling, at least as an argument against specifically Christianity, is, the cultural isolation of other cultures. So perhaps you'll have a child in India or Africa who would never know the message of Christ, at least not directly from any sort of word of mouth or biblical scripture. Would you generally take like the psi position where God would never send you to hell for the God that you don't know, but only for the God that you reject and do know? Or is it more of a, God will reveal himself to these people through love and grace, independent of whether or not they recognize it consciously? And how do you reconcile that with the claims of, free will being the deterministic factor there?
Well, I would actually say, and I think I'd actually look at a couple of your opinions and put them together, because I would say, number one, if you have there's no way that you've discussed, Jesus, the call was when Jesus came down. Basically, Jesus now is the leader, and he actually told his disciples when God basically broke up the nations with the Tower of Babel. What's really interesting is Jesus reclaimed all the nations. So he called his disciples to go to the 70 different places that had been, assigned to these other beings in the Tower of Babel. And so that's why his disciples were so adamant about getting out to places like Spain. But I want to say, going back to what you're saying, so what about a person who's, so we've slowly, Christianity's been growing over the years as a portion of the greater population on the earth. And at one point, it's going to be overtaking the earth as far as from what the Bible says in the book of Revelation. But what I wanted to say is, what about the person who's, say, in the middle of Africa, who has absolutely no exposure, who believes in some sort of higher power, but doesn't know who the power is? I think God will have a lot of mercy on that person. But he won't have as much mercy on the one who rejects Jesus, who knows all about Jesus and chooses to reject, as it says pretty clearly in the Bible. So it's whether or not you have the knowledge. And then someone would say, well, then why did you have to tell me? I've heard atheists say that. Why did you have to tell me? If you didn't tell me about it, then I wouldn't have to reject him because I would have never known. You actually sent me. It's your fault. I have to go. It's like some atheists tell me.
Well,
So,
that's an interesting argument. I wouldn't really say that the atheist there is making a consistent argument from logical reasoning, but regardless, I would say I find it interesting how perhaps there's exceptions that can be made for people who don't know God. I guess it begs the larger question. Well, I guess not begs. It asks the larger question, like, in a God world where perhaps God can exercise mercy here, exercise justice here, do you think there's any sort of leniency with someone like, for example, myself, who reasons honestly and comes to the conclusion that there is no God, and then, I die and I'm standing before the Lord and under your worldview? Do you think, for example, someone like a Christopher Hitchens, who, directly preached against the Christian religion, would be treated with more mercy than someone like, for example, myself, who's more just taking an intellectual criticism approach to the idea of theology in general versus, directly attacking the foundations of Christianity?
yeah, no, I think that, I think that God's made it clear in the Bible that his punishments are going to be fitted to the type of crime. And so I would say somebody like Christopher Hitchens, who was out there heaping abuse on Christians, and someone like Richard Dawkins, who basically has been heaping abuse on God and saying that God's this moral monster and all that kind of stuff. That's a really dangerous position to take. So I wouldn't have the guts to even think about doing something like that because I fear God. I can't even imagine a position where you don't. And so that's just something I think about. And so the Bible, as you know, since you have 27 Bibles.
Yeah, I do. I know a few verses.
Romans 1 says that you actually do have knowledge of God, but you've suppressed it. And so I know that you don't want to, I know you won't agree with me on that, but I believe that.
No, I do have knowledge. I do have knowledge of God claims for sure. I have knowledge of Christ. I have knowledge of the Bible. I do have those. And if suppression means I don't find them sufficient, then yes, I guess Romans is correct in that way.
Okay, that's reasonable. So, okay, so you had asked me something. Oh yeah, let's go back to the person, because you reminded me of another thing. I like C.S. Lewis's view on this kind of thing too, because I think about what about the good Muslims or the good Hindus or people who didn't, they were raised in a faith and they really hadn't been exposed to Jesus or Christianity. Maybe they're immersed in this Arab country, or they're immersed in the middle of India or something like that. I think about, well, what about those people? And it reminds me of, well, what about, you look in the Bible and you say, well, what about some of the pagans and the people in Jesus's history and in his past? And what about those people? And is every single person who was not a child of God in Israel in the ancient times going to be going to hell or be going to Hades? And I don't think so. I think that God made all of his people, and I think he loves all of his people. I think he loves his children. And so I think many of them could be in the middle of a Muslim country, or they could be in the middle of a Hindu country. And when they're faced with Jesus at the end of life, I think that they'll make the choice to accept him in a lot of cases. And so that would be my view.
Intriguing. Could I ask a quick question about Genesis that I find particularly interesting?
Sure.
So there's a part in Genesis after the tribes start splitting out, and this is after the Adam and Eve lineage. This is even after, Cain and Abel, where they start talking about, moving on from the traditionalist center, which I'm assuming they're talking to like ancient day Judea or something along those lines. So you have a verse in the Bible, and forgive me, I can't cite it at the ready. I could perhaps look it up, but it says something about other nations in that, which I find interesting because my general perspective on that is that the Bible was written for a Judeo-centric view of the world to explain the Judeo-culture traditions. And I'm curious what you think of the idea that perhaps the Bible, the creation story in the Bible, is describing a Judeo-centric view of creation versus an actual worldwide centric view of creation.
I think it's not just a Judeo view, actually. I think because if you go and you look at the parallels between the Bible and in Genesis, and you look at things like the, what was it called? The Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you look at some of these other ancient Near Eastern tales of the worldwide flood and those sorts of things, you're going to see that they actually fit together, and you would expect that. You would think that they'd go together. So yes, it was written basically for the Jewish people, and it was written in Jewish times with Jewish laws, and that's why the whole Mosaic thing and Mosaic laws, that was for the Jewish people of the ancient times. But the Bible in the New Testament stretches this out to apply to all of the Gentiles and everybody around the world. And that's what's fascinating about the Bible. It was all about the Jews, And they were chosen to be the ones who deliver the good news. And only a remnant of them remain. The rest of them reject Jesus. And then Jesus goes out to all of the Gentiles. And Jews who accept Jesus.
So I know we have a lot of good literature on floods around the Middle Eastern countries, like for example, kind of around Judea, but there isn't a whole lot of, at least that I'm aware of, textual scripture that would attest to a flood in, Africa or early Eurasian China. There isn't a whole lot of attestation to the flood there. Would you say that if we were to find that historically, would that perhaps strengthen the case, and independent of that, we can say, a critique is there isn't a lot of contemporary accounts of flooding outside of Judea and the immediate countries surrounding it?
Yeah, I'm one of the things about Genesis is I'm kind of on the fence on a lot of different things going on in Genesis. I'm an old Earth person. I believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. I believe that the universe is about 13 or 14 billion years old. I'm behind all of that stuff. And I think that the Bible doesn't force us into a young Earth creationist view. That said, if God did want to, that said, it's really interesting how historical portion of humanity has only really existed for a relatively short period of time, given the age of the Earth and given even the age of what we estimate humans to be, 200,000 years or so. And so given that kind of stuff, it's really interesting that everything's sort of packed in the last 5,000 years. And
I had someone tell me that God, for the majority of the time that the Earth was created, was just playing a game of solo checkers until he decided to make, man and all those sorts of things. It's more of a joke in that sense. But I do think it's interesting how the Genesis story seems to take place mostly around 5,000 years ago ish. And if we take the best scientific models, we see an Earth that's vastly older than that. Mm-hmm. So I guess I would be curious. So why would God wait so long to create, a species in his own image? And so and the Bible kind of starts only 5,000 years ago, when apparently the world existed several billion before that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And so there's two things here. One is the issue of time. God's not bound by our kind of linear time. So to him, the length of time is a second could be something that to us is millions of years. And so because he's outside of time as a transcendent Lord. But the other thing that just to think about is the other thing with time. Wait, I was trying to remember what I was just going to say. Oh, a couple things with the flood. If people thought that the flood was global, it could have there's different ways to look at that. There's one way to look at it as a flood that's global, as a flood that covers the entire Earth or covers the entire world as they knew it at that time, which could be the ancient Near East. And so I'm very flexible on that as well, on what my interpretation is of that. But the third thing I want to mention is Hugh Ross's book, Improbable Planet, talks a lot about how the Earth would have been completely unlivable when it was very first formed, because of the atmosphere and the ways that certain things had to marry, essentially, or to marinate, if you will. And so by the time that we've been put on the planet, it's actually now the atmosphere and oxygen and all of the levels are appropriate to the flourishing of humanity. So it's kind of an interesting thing. A lot of the stuff that came and went and died and lived and all that kind of stuff, it's actually been essential to bringing the Earth about to something that we can survive in. And so
do you think there's anything to the idea that perhaps it's good evidence against the Genesis story that, God waits for so long, even though, at any time God could make the conditions right? Presumptively he is, the classical God of theism, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. So it's at what point do we have to reconcile kind of how long it took? And perhaps, your argument makes some sense. I would say that, maybe you wait for an Earth that's more capable of housing humans. But I guess that begs the question, right? Why wouldn't Earth begin to house God's preferred creature? And why, spend billions of years cultivating it from the ground up when obviously God was not required to do so?
No, he does. It's just, see, that's one of the things where you just have to give it over to the sovereignty of God and realize that there are answers to questions we don't have necessarily. Some people say, well, why is the universe so large? There's so much wasted space. I hear that a lot. And I think, well, according to the way like Hugh Ross looks at a lot of this kind of stuff, and he says, well, the Earth is so precisely positioned in the Milky Way galaxy, on this certain kind of galaxy, in this certain kind of solar system, with something like Jupiter protecting us from meteorites and all of these other kinds of situations that would make it really incredible that, it makes it really incredible that we're here and that higher levels of life can flourish here, because we haven't found any other planets that we've observed that are even close to having the habitable zones we have. And so there's just some cool I want to say something. John Lloyd is in the chat and he's got a couple of questions here. He says 500 flood legends worldwide. So he knows more than we do about how many flood legends are out there. I haven't been following that too much.
Yeah, I'd like to see the links to those. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, John, if you've got more information on that, I like, were there floods in Australia? I'd like to know. So that would be, I want to know that, seriously. And so, and also he says, what calendar year is it according to China? And I don't know what calendar year. I do know that they live by things like Year of the Rat, though.
Yeah, I would not exactly an expert in Chinese calendars, but.
Yeah, so that's okay, yeah, so we don't really know that one, but yeah, it would be interesting, John, if you want to give us any information about these floods, I'd always like to hear about that. And I mean, that's the other idea. I took historical geology when I was in college, and I remember talking about, was it called Pangea, I believe, where all the continents were sort of smushed together. And then over time, that also gives us evidence more of an older planet, essentially. And so, but it also explains things like, no, that wouldn't make sense. I was just thinking of something with the spreading out of humans, but that doesn't apply, because it happened way before the spreading out of humans.
Yes, Pangea was spreading apart way before human beings were even created.
Yeah. So there's just a lot of interesting things when we look at that kind of thing. So now you said you were raised in a creationist family, right?
Yeah.
So is there any, and then John has actually also said here, 4718 supports young Earth creation. Oh, so the Chinese calendar says it's 4,718 years. That's interesting. The Chinese calendar says. Okay, so so that's interesting. Yeah, so there's a lot of people. Oh, wait, I've got Sentinel Apologetics here in the Zoom queue. Good. We got someone to join us. Hold on. Oops. I just dropped something. Do you know Rowe?
No, I don't believe so.
Good. Well, now you're about to know him. he's Sentinel Apologetics, and he and I are also. I believe he's also still a big fan of Michael Heiser. And Rob, just to let you know, I sent Michael an email, and he said he would probably talk to me in September. So I'm really excited about it.
Sweet. That's good.
Yeah. So Rob's from Australia.
Hi, Rob. How are you?
Hey.
Actually, did you guys, I don't think I did a formal introduction for either of you guys. Did you guys want to share a little information about yourselves? I know I got a little bit from Christian on your past, but if you guys want to just share a little information as you're coming in here.
I'll let him go first. I don't really have much to plug, so.
Yeah, I just like to stay cutting edge with the Bible and scientific research.
Yeah, good. And so you can find him at Sentinel Apologetics. I know that, and do you have Christian, do you happen to have a YouTube channel too?
Yeah, I do. There isn't any content on it. I'm actually launching it this next Monday, as far as content will go. We're doing a lot of stuff there, but if you just look up my name on YouTube, you'll find that I've done some call-in shows, some interviews and stuff like that. But
okay, good. Yeah, so he was pretty bold, Robert, because he's an atheist. He's an 18-year-old atheist, and he decided to just jump in here without, just being as brave as he is.
I just saw the link, so I decided to click on it as well. So I have no idea what you guys are discussing.
Oh, okay. So we were talking a little bit about the Bible, Genesis, and the flood, and evidence for in old Earth versus a young Earth, and those sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So that's one thing, and I wanted
to
say,
an atheist?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
So Robert, who did you have on your channel? I just watched your channel with a couple of people. You've been doing a lot on your channel, and I think you just had Michael Heiser on again, or who did you have? No, Hugh Ross. That's who I saw.
Yeah, I had I was attending his paradoxes class for like 8 sessions on human exceptionalism and human origins. So I decided to cut all the relevant parts and make it into this long 10-hour stream, and that's what I did. So
that's what it was, because every time I kept going into YouTube and it kept saying premiering, and I thought, my gosh, how long is this thing?
Yeah,
it's like he's like a track star here.
yeah. No, people enjoyed it. Yeah.
So
I just found you and subscribed, by the way. So
sweet.
Oh, that's great. So Rob, what are you reading lately? What kind of books? Obviously, you're going to Hugh Ross's class.
Right now, I'm reading Carol Hill's latest release. Basically, it's a book that she's been working on for 20 years. Carol Hill, are you familiar with Carol Hill?
No, I'm not.
She wrote a few blogs for Biologos, and she also wrote. In fact, I think she's one of the founding directors for the American Scientific Affiliation. It's sort of like professional scientists, but who are Christian. And she's been working on a book for 20 years that she released last November. And all the stuff that you saw me talk about with Jeffrey Rose, the anthropologist, so basically everything you see on my channel, the really creepy thing or part of the whole book is that everything you see in the book is like my own private musings and the research I've been privately looking into. And so what she's done is she's sort of amalgamated and synthesized all the stuff in the 20 years that sort of I've been, putting together as well. But she's done it in a more professional sense because she's a professional geologist. And so, yeah. So the flood models that you see me talk about, exactly the same, all that stuff. So it's really cool. So I might actually interview her.
That's actually something that, I would like that, because I remember when you were on my channel one time, you were talking about the flood models in the ancient Near East, and you had some information about that. And so that completely applies to what Christian and I were just talking about too, about this ancient flood. And do you take it as a global flood, or would you take it as maybe a local flood that they thought was their world?
Yeah, so it's a bit of both. It's universal in the sense that from their perspective, she gives like 4 or 5 different interpretations on just Genesis 7 alone, if you put yourself in the shoes of Noah. And on top of that, the nuances of the material used for the ark. So it's not like Ken Ham's ark. It's actually a reed boat. Out of reeds, you make this hut-looking boat, which is, the Marsh Arabs, they do the same thing today. So anyway, the point is, if you put it all together, oh boy, yeah, it does look like a huge destructive thing going on, kind of like the Japanese tsunami, but from a sort of like global context. Oh no, it's just the Persian Gulf being filled in. So,
Rob, out of curiosity, how would you, for example, bridge the gap between historical evidence for a flood at X time and making sure that that's actually what the Bible is describing? Is it like a deductive argument, or is it more like preferential induction? Like what necessarily are you doing in that respect?
I want to say hi to Nathan Ormond really quick. He joined us too. So
hey, Nathan.
Right.
By the way, Nathan, I enjoyed your interview with a
Dr.
Australian philosopher. Yeah, Liz. Yeah. That's really cool.
That's on my list to watch.
That's a good question, and I think that question is quite. You can answer that question quite simply, in the sense that I treat the Bible as a human text, and I'm still a Christian. So to put it another way, I treat the Bible as a divine human text. So if God is indeed communicating through the text, I'm not treating it like how, say, Muslims treat the Quran, or how some Christians do treat the Bible. The whole concept of theopneustos, that is God breathed. So literally there's dictation. The book comes out of heaven, so to speak, like the Quran. So what I'm saying is, when I look at all the ancient Near Eastern material in light of what we read in the Bible, there's a lot of overlap, but I find it curious that the biblical statement about how God allots, and this is Heiser's point, how God allots the other nations under other gods, that means those other nations have their own inspiration of their own theology and events. And so therefore Israel is a unique vehicle to communicate this particular message leading into Jesus. So therefore, when we do independent anthropological research purely from a naturalistic context on human origins from Africa 150,000 years ago, and all that stuff, the migration patterns and where they settle and all that, it's interesting how the biblical text does. So the biblical text is saying something, but more from a theological context, and then the naturalistic sciences will also say pretty much the same thing, but purely from a naturalistic context, and they don't seem to contradict. And what else can you do with that piece of data if they don't contradict? You just see that they overlap. Yeah.
You can interrupt me anytime, Stephanie. I just had another quick question for Rob. So are you at all well versed in the historicity and the timings of the gospel writings at all?
I'm not. I don't proclaim to be a specialist, but I suppose it depends on the question, and if there's something, I'll probably direct you to like a study or a scholarly paper. I could probably do that if I'm not proficient in it.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Would you agree that Mark was probably the first written gospel?
Sure. I know that, say, Mark Goodacre is one who doesn't really prioritize Markan superiority, or like Mark is the first, in the sense that there are scholars that will say that the decay, and if there's like a proto-Mark, some say there's a Q source.
I guess kind of just secondarily, would you generally say that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, or are the Gospels more secondary accounts based on knowledge that they gain from oral tradition?
A bit of both. So I would say that Bockham actually is the guy I would advise. He's just released a second edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. So I would say, generally speaking, the New Testament did not exist at Pentecost. The New Testament then becomes a literary form under the typical style of Jewish narrative, specifically Matthew, Mark being first, because the Christians at the time, the only Bible they had was the Old Testament. Peter's preaching just straight from the Old Testament. So the question is, how do you use the Old Testament to defend Resurrection Sunday? That's what they were doing. And so then the New Testament becomes this evolutionary process of, because time is not static in the early days of the church. It's a very dynamic thing. Things are changing all the time, specifically leading to the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem. So that's a huge key context, especially with respect, say, to the book of Revelation. So yeah, I would say it's a bit of both. I would say they were well aware and acquainted with what Jesus said and did. And then you have a dedicated writing process, kind of like how Luke opens his gospel. I've taken the time to evaluate all the details and so on, and then I'm going to write to you, Theophilus, like his 2 volumes. So
yeah, I guess, would you say, as far as when we're talking about like the historicity of Mark and like the eyewitness accounts, would you generally make the case that the other 3 gospels are based on Mark's writing, or would you say they were independent analyses of the life and resurrection of or supposed resurrection of Christ?
Again, same thing. So I would say there's an overlap, definitely Mark and priority, and at the same time there's a lot of unique sort of like say Matthew has his own style in certain areas, Luke as well, John definitely.
Yeah, I would say that the synoptics are absolutely linked, and they've shown that there's lots and lots of overlap. But the interesting thing is and John is pretty much different. John basically speaks of the miracles and that sort of thing. But if you go back and you look at what their positions were, it's interesting that John's the only one who includes the story of them going fishing after Jesus's resurrection, and he numbers the fish 153, and you would expect that because John's a fisherman. You've got Matthew as the only one who reveals the story about the tax that Jesus had found, that told Peter to go get this coin out of a fish's mouth to pay their taxes. And of course, Matthew's a tax collector. You have Mark, who's a friend of Peter, and so some of the stories that he tells are knowledge of something Peter would know, and he was very close with Peter. And then Luke is a doctor, and so some of the stuff that he goes into is giving specific details that only a doctor would really want to describe, like some of the stuff that happened to Jesus in the garden. And so it's just, I think that there's internal evidence that supports the authors as we believe that there are, to whom they've been attributed. And I think that even if we only had one book in the whole Bible, which say it's one of the books from Paul, like 1 Corinthians, I think we've got enough with that without any of the Gospels to support the case of Christianity.
Yeah. Just quickly, have you heard of mimesis, Christian?
No.
It doesn't immediately sound familiar.
So, for example, Dennis MacDonald, he's written a book called, I think published back in the year 2000. He wrote a book called, and he's not a Christian, by the way. I take that back. He is a Christian, but he's not I guess you could say he's a very liberal, non-conservative Christian. But he wrote a book called Homer and Mark's Mimesis of Homer's Iliad.
Mm.
And so you have, again, another layer of complexity in regards to something like Mark. Like Mark seems to be a very shotgun approach, and yet Mark is written specifically for a Greco-Roman audience, and that brilliantly fits with this thing called mimesis. Mimesis just means imitation. So Mark imitates the Iliad, so to speak, and then
are we saying Mark because we actually think that a person named Mark wrote these, or are we saying Mark because that's what the actual Gospels are called?
Yeah, and that's a question. It's like you have that it's written according to Mark in the Greek, and so then that's the it's sort of like a stalemate. Like obviously critical scholars will not take into account the actual person Mark writing it. People of his faith will say it is with church tradition.
Yeah, I would say it's John Mark, and he's referenced a few times in Paul's writings.
Sure.
And so, but that's obviously an argument that I would have to make against people who don't make that same argument. But before I forget, I see Nathan. I want to have Nathan introduce himself. Now, Nathan's been on my channel a few times. He is an agnostic turned Christian turned agnostic, and Pine Creek Doug has something to do with that. So I wanted to have Nathan say hello.
Hello.
That's one heck of a life story, Nathan.
Yeah, thanks. It's I don't know. I guess I'm just interested in a lot of this stuff. And I saw that you were having this conversation, SJ, so I thought I'd just jump in, and if I had anything to contribute it, but so far not really.
It's always good to see Nathan.
What does agnostic mean to you, Nathan, out of curiosity?
To me personally, I mean, and this isn't a definition anyone else has to accept, but my definition for myself is that I don't know whether or not a God exists. Now, I kind of, I'd divide between like belief and knowledge, and I'd say on some days, I can kind of have beliefs or propositional attitudes towards the way the world is that would be kind of theistic. On some days, more like hard atheism. Like I'm sure naturalism's true, and my, like all of these inclinations I have are just kind of biological tricks and stuff like that. And so the agnosticism for me is about like that tethering of my experience of reality to reality itself. And when it comes to like theological statements and things like that, I don't think I have knowledge.
So this question's either going to make a lot of sense or no sense.
Okay.
Are you more on the side of Descartes or Hume when it comes to grounding existence?
It depends on what particular things. Like for example, I like a lot of Descartes stuff. Again, I'm kind of whimsical day to day. Like some days I'll be like, yeah, what Descartes doing, building things from like first principles of certainty, the way he views like justification for the outside external world and stuff like that. It all makes sense. Other days though, I'll be thinking, well, I tend towards like idealism and stuff, but some days my idealism will be kind of Humean. I'll be like, well, could I be this kind of bundle of perceptions? And I'm confusing similarity of these perceptions for identity, for being part of the same thing. And I mean, I just kind of go back and forth with a lot of these things. I don't know.
Yeah, I would say the epistemic grounding issue is one of the main reasons why I still have issues with the God does not exist claim. because there's a huge issue with epistemic grounding when it comes to, can Descartes actually claim I think therefore I am, without running into a bunch of issues with, Hume's critiques of, well, how do you know that it's true that you think? And it's all sorts of these textual criticisms. But it's interesting how you would say that, because I talk to a lot of apologetics and interacting with the teleological argument and the ontological argument or the transcendental argument, but none I've found more convincing than we have a fundamental problem with grounding reality, and independent of a grounding, we have a real issue with epistemic justification. And I'm curious what Rob and SJ think of how religion can play a part in epistemic grounding.
Yeah,
It depends. It depends on that thing called religion. Like for me, if it's something to do with, say, supernatural miracles, or
I guess a God. I mean, I don't necessarily mean religion. I mean a God, or the God, depending on what you want to talk about.
Yeah, I take the Romans 12:1 and 2 principle. So that is in the Greek. It says, offer yourselves as a living sacrifice, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, and, renew your minds. For this is your logical way to worship. And that logical worship there in the Greek is literally, you could translate that as scientific worship, meaning it's that logos principle, it's engaging the mind. So therefore, I find it curious that in the first century, take say, the book of Sirach. It's a Second Temple text, chapter 38. If you have a medical ailment, a physical ailment, look to the gift of God through His supernatural providence from the produce of the earth, meaning scientists who take medicine out of, say, bark and so on, out of plants and vegetation and trees. Don't neglect that. Like actually give credence and honor to the doctor, to the physician, to the scientist, who, at the end of the day, God's the result for, the reason why that's even possible. So therefore, this epistemic question, so that question, I think, would be a good challenging question to, say, a charismatic who may rely too much on the supernatural and not so much on what's grounded in the natural process. But at the same time, I think the atheist is, and I hate to say this, but is being intellectually lazy by only just looking at physical things like this. And
what do you mean by atheist, out of curiosity?
Someone who doesn't have the quote-unquote God in a perspective on observing reality, regardless of what it is. It could be looking at,
so just a worldview absent God.
Yeah, it's, for example, you could go, like, over here, I live right next to the ocean in Australia. I see the sunset over the Indian Ocean. If I'm going for a surf or a jog, two things goes through my mind. On one evening, I might be looking at that sunset and just basking in the beauty of just not only the fact that you're seeing that take place, but you're looking at, people just admiring that and taking photos. Then the other thing that goes through my mind, which I don't think a lot of people have this anyway, but, being in the sciences, I can't help but go, that's a hydrogen bomb that's been exploding for 4.5 billion years. So many 90 million miles away. And now and the earth is rotating, and the sun's obviously going beneath the horizon. And then I just think about how it just takes 1 hour, at, say, 100 kilometers an hour to then reach into outer space, and how delicate and fragile reality actually is. And then I start getting to that existential angst in that sense over something as simple and beautiful as just a simple sunset. So it's one of those two things. Yeah.
The existential question is an interesting one, in the sense that I do often look at the fragility of reality and think, perhaps it is the case that some greater explanation than naturalism is required. I'm curious, though, how much of an explanation do you think that a God can give? Like, how much explanatory power do you think that a grounding principle like that can give, if, for example, I have no sufficient reasons to buy that as the reason why reality is bound together? Like, it seems to be getting kind of dangerously close to a God of the gaps. I know it really isn't, but it seems to be getting to the, we have a grounding problem epistemically, and there's a lot of things that are fragile about reality. And the best way to explain that is God. And I guess the question would be like, how much explanatory power can God really give on epistemic questions when God, the explanation itself, is so complicated?
Yeah, I would say I would agree, and because just quickly, my story is that I was an atheist 10 years ago, and I got into Christianity. So it's the last 10 years has been like kind of like my walk into it, growing in that. But the key thing that got me to accept Christianity is exactly that question. And my, I guess you could say, and it's not 100% foolproof, but it is something that's satisfactory to me, to then accept the God hypothesis as, so the God of gaps here doesn't become throw your hands up in the air sort of thing. It's a genuine, if God exists, then yeah, then that's what has to happen. So Romans 1:20 clearly says, if you look to nature, you can then have an implicit understanding of God's invisible attributes. The key word there is invisible. But then the other key word is an implicit sort of understanding. So therefore, you can fall very easily into a trap to say, the whole fine-tuning argument, which Hugh Ross's work is brilliant, but even Hugh Ross will say, just at that level, it's clear, the fine-tuning's there, but you still can't really argue for God explicitly. So the only, as far as I can tell, the only tangible evidence for God is the incarnation of the Logos in Jesus. If that actually happened, and if Jesus actually did die and rise from the grave, literally, it doesn't matter where in human history that happens. It could have happened 5 minutes ago. It could have happened 10,000 years ago. You only need that one event of God incarnating and then doing what he did. If that actually happened, God exists, and then everything then falls into place.
Couldn't you, for example, say, you could make a similar claim about Islam. If Muhammad was in fact the prophet from God, then Allah is the real God. It seems to me to be like a slight begging of the question. Like, of course, if the Jesus story is true and he was the son of God, then yes, obviously the Bible is true, and we have Christianity as vindicated. But it's more of a question not if it's true, but like, can we demonstrate reasonably that we can come to that conclusion as a sufficient explanation?
So 1 John 1, the first, not John's gospel, John's first letter, he literally opens the letter by saying, what existed in the aeons in the past, but now what we've touched with our hands, seen with our eyes, heard, this is the word of life. So for the sake of argument, in the first century, that's literally what John is saying, that, empirically, we've experienced it. The problem now is people living after the fact, right? That's why I said it's not a bulletproof sort of statement, because you could ask the same thing about, say, Islam and so on. And now so therefore, a Muslim will have an equal say in this discussion in regards to his walk and his faith and so on. So therefore, then all I have to do is go, okay, let's roll up our sleeves and actually do the investigation. Let's see if the Quran and this thing called Allah and that whole Islamic theology, let's see if that actually holds up. From my perspective and from my research into the Quran and Islam, it doesn't hold up. Now the thing is, you start to now do an analysis of all the data points, and as far as from what I can see, the religion that has the most explanatory power happens to be the biblical religion from a first century context. All the filters of the church, like say Catholic and then Reformation and so on, those are all filters. I don't care about all that. I care about the happenings, when Jesus supposedly came down and all that.
I want to ask something to actually, just for anyone to answer this, but also going to Rob to focus on this one issue of human exceptionalism that you were talking with Hugh Ross, and you took and made a 10-hour video. What are a couple of the key arguments for human exceptionalism? Because I think it does actually relate to the question that Christian's bringing up, in this idea that our ability to reason, our ability to plan for the future, our ability to even talk and communicate as we do. There's the language. There's a lot of reasons that humans are exceptional, but I'm wondering what's sort of the crux of 10 hours of hard labor there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll boil it down to this. This is a fine-tuning argument. Probably my favorite would be the chromosome 2 fusion event, where that in itself, the probability of that happening is 10 to the minus 1 million. Now, do you put God in the gaps in that? If God, like, again, it goes back to that question. If God, actually exists, and I'm using the argument that Jesus is evidence for that, then yeah, that fusion event, which is really improbable, is the result of a divine working. But then that doesn't neglect the evolutionary process in that. It's not like God.
Well, the reason why like I'll object to a God of the gaps is not because your conclusion can't be true, but that it's hard for me to know if it's consistently true. So when you say, like, for example, we have a really low probability of life existing in the way that it does, I agree with you. I'm just questioning. Can we say with a reasonable confidence that in the absence of a sufficient probability that we can plug in the God explanation? And the reason why I would say that that's really shaky to me is because I don't see a difference between saying that and saying, we have a low probability. Let's insert an explanation that can account for it. But explanations that can account for something are different than explanations that do in fact account for something.
You'll have to give me an example.
So here's a quick one, right? If I light a match, right? I strike it on the matchstick and I light it.
Yep.
You can explain the phenomenon of lighting something with a small gremlin that lights it from the background. You can explain it that way. There's nothing logically contradicting about that, unless you dig into, for example, do gremlins exist, which is the God question presuppositionally, right? So there are explanations that can explain things, but it has to become a question of what explanation does explain things as opposed to what can, because there's a lot of explanations that are not logically contradicting, but there's no actual way to say that they actually did do that.
So are you saying that, for example, back in the Greco-Roman period, because they had the concept of the 4 elements, right, where they actually went out of the way to say that, fire is due to some form of divine entity that's sort of keeping it going, so to speak. And they actually made those arguments. So now that we understand from a physical chemistry context what fire is, things that can cause fire, you have the triangle effect, like for bushfires, things like that. And so therefore it's a very naturalistic, obviously a naturalistic explanation. So therefore there's no reason to posit something that is
are you aware
not
of
part
the
of the
verse?
system.
Are you aware of the verse that says, with God all things are possible?
Yeah.
So I guess what that verse demonstrates, at least to me, is that if you get to the conclusion that God exists, then by necessity in the Bible, you have the answer to possibility, because with God, all things are possible. But the most important part of that statement isn't the all things are possible, it's with God. So what I'm saying is, while you can have an explanation that works epistemically, I'm more concerned about, I mean ontologically. You can have a definition that works ontologically, but perhaps isn't sufficient epistemically. And I'm curious, outside of saying like the probability is low and the Christian God gives a sufficient or a can explanation, how do we bridge the gap between the Christian God could potentially explain this through scriptural evidence to this is in fact what happened, at least sufficient enough to where I could say, okay, it's more likely than not.
So yeah, let's go right to the start. So say we take Genesis 1. We don't interpret the scientific details with what the passage is saying, and we don't interpret the passage with what the scientific details are saying. The Genesis account, or the Bible, is obviously a religious theological text to communicate theology. theology proper, God proper. When we look at natural history, it's not, so for example, like human chromosome 2 event, that is one out of a whole accumulation of things that are before it and after it. Not only at the biological level, also at the geological level, and at the solar system level, and then at the cosmic universal level. Lawrence Krauss will go out of his way to say, ultimately, it's the whole dark energy constant, 10 to the minus 122, and from 10 to the minus 1 million figure, it jumps to 10 to the minus 27 million figure, as far as, the Planck epoch all the way to Homo sapien. That process is so improbable that I think what you're getting at is, okay, let's go along with that 10 to the minus 27 million figure. Why would that equate it to being, God did it? Because I could find another permutation that may have been missed, like maybe 10 years from now, and then that just jumps to 10 to the minus 27 million and one, just one more added to that 27 million. So now does this 10 to the minus 27 million and one become the new quote unquote number to then establish, God did it? And I do sympathize with that argument, because that is refuting the misuse of the fine-tuning argument, where people sort of use it as like an explicit piece of evidence. Again, all I'm saying is, when you lay it all out, and you do it in an implicit way, you can't, well, at least from my perspective on looking at the science, you can't help but see, or I can't help but see, this thing called providence taking place leading up to now you and I having this discussion. And in between you and I having the discussion and the start of the universe 13.8 billion years ago, a specific event to cause a resolve to the ultimate question of life, this thing called chaos kampf, struggle against chaos, happened. To solve it happened, which is the cross, Jesus, resurrection. If that's ruled out, I might as well become like what Nathan's is right now, just agnostic, or even at best deist.
That was a bit of a strange return. It might, as if it's negative to just become what Nathan is.
Rob, I just out of curiosity.
I meant because Nathan's your position is, I think, the most honest position, in the sense that you are still being open-minded. You're not closing the doors to God, but at the same time, you're being careful with not just following into a belief system just for the sake of believing it.
Well, I'm trying to be like that, but I'm still tribal and have my dispositions and so forth.
And we all know that. Yeah.
Let me ask this, because I've got a super chat here from John Lloyd, and he wants to know about thoughts on Adam and Eve, and he asked specifically for Christians' thoughts on Adam and Eve. But it'd actually be interesting to hear all of your thoughts on Adam and Eve, as far as, do you believe that there are two real people named Adam and Eve who were the very first humans, or do you believe something else?
So just quickly. That can lead straight into my next point, and I don't want to. That's the thing, Christian. I don't want to like take over the conversation by just me talking. But
no, you're fine, Rob.
Let's take, for example, what you see in the Genesis account. You have an accurate depiction of natural history, so that the account not only is written in an ancient Near Eastern sort of polemic, like a temple inauguration. Because don't forget, it's a Jewish text, so obviously it matches the descriptions of the tabernacle and so on, but it also has to account for the ancient Near Eastern myths, creation myths. But then I take what's called a concordance approach, where if this text is applicable to a 21st century reader, or pretty much any future reader who gets more sophisticated in the science, that I would expect God to actually, again, if God's the one inspiring the text, to engineer the text in such a way that it does accommodate that as well. So when I look at Genesis 1, I can't help but go, wow, yeah, it fits Earth's natural history along with evolution perfectly. So then this whole Adam and Eve question, which they are in the Persian Gulf, again, the text doesn't say that they're the first humans, but it does say that they are the first high priests of a particular location God decides to localize himself in. And the introduction of ethics is quite curious with the way what's called the Nefesh creatures, the animals, how they are meant to behave versus how this new Nefesh creature, which is the human, how they are meant to behave. And again, human anthropology seems to just match the descriptions you see. So then all I have to do is go, if I didn't know about the Jesus figure, and if all I knew was Genesis 1 and 2, I would be like, okay, was this person writing as a really like he's close to being omniscient as far as not only the natural history of Earth, but also the disposition of the human psyche in the early epochs of, say, the late Pleistocene period leading into the Holocene. Like whoever wrote this is not only hitting on all those theological points, but putting that aside, he's actually detailing natural history quite accurately. Who is this person that wrote Genesis 1 and 2? So you see that will cause me to question, like, wow, like he's pretty insightful, you know.
Hey, Rob, it just Pine Creek Doug, who converted Nathan to agnosticism's in the chat, and Nathan says in the chat, "Help! They're converting me."
So I guess just to kind of answer what Rob said, when I'm reading Genesis, I'm thinking two things, which is, are we talking about a population specific first two people, or are we talking about an actual species first people? And I would say that if you were to read the Bible as the actually first two individuals, to me that flies in the face of population-based evolution. Yep. And the actual theory that we have. So what I would say is, if you read the Bible under the context that it's, you know, the first high priest and high priestess of that actual localized area, it makes a whole bunch more sense than if you were to say it's the actual beginning of the human race. But kind of outside of that, the Genesis account has always been really interesting for me, because I think we maybe have a disagreement there, Rob. I don't think the Genesis account is overwhelmingly accurate to taxonomic history or geological history. But even if I granted you that, which I'm willing to do for the sake of argument, I'm curious. This is another thing where we get into, like, can versus does. Like, can we have a Bible that corresponds to certain parts of history? But if we were to remove, for example, Genesis 2:4 and say replace it with a slightly different wording of the text, it's no longer accurate, but it still can explain other parts of the geological history. So it becomes a question of, how can we go from this can explain?
What in Genesis 2:4 are you specifically?
I just picked a random Genesis verse, to be honest with you. I'm just saying you could take any historical claim in Genesis and replace it with the polar opposite, and you still have a book that can explain the origins of that particular area. Sure, it's wrong on that one issue, but it still can explain it.
Okay, let me put it this way then. Since we actually do know, and let's go along with the critical scholarship of Genesis, that, you know, the JEDP hypothesis, Wellhausen hypothesis, that it could have been in the 600s BC. So Babylonian exile finally compiled, right? Okay, let's go along with that. The point is, I mean, I take a more critical, conservative approach, a mix of the two, in the sense that there is Genesis 1 to 11 is what's called proto-history, and from a literary context, meaning I think it does go back thousands of years, not the 600 BC. But for the sake of argument, critical scholarship ultimately says 600 BC. All right. I find it interesting that even when you do that, you have to give me an example in the text that shows, okay, this contradicts natural history. Because when you actually trace out, so what's called Second Temple Jewish literature, which is around the 400s.
I think you're misunderstanding what I said, Rob. I want to jump in because I didn't.
No. I'm gonna give you one verse as an example. So this is Genesis 1:20. So in Genesis 1:20, it just flatly says, out of the oceans, so God says, let the ocean swarm with living creatures, and then let birds fly. And literally in the Greek, especially in the Septuagint, it's the birds deriving from the waters. Now, from 400 BC onwards, so the Second Temple period, well into the church, well into Darwin, actually. Christians were like, what the heck? Well, Jews before Christians, and then Christians afterwards were like, what the heck is this? Birds coming out of the waters? And you actually, if you can actually trace the commentaries, Genesis commentary is where they're just conjecturing. Even Calvin in the 1500s was like, atheists in my day are mocking this verse because fish and birds have no relationship. Then you get to Philip Schaff, which is a church historian in the 1800s, obviously in light of Darwinian evolution in his period. He was alive when Darwin was around. And he's translating Basil, Saint Basil from the 300s AD, who picked up on that. And Basil conjectures going, well, since I'm a Christian, I'm going to accept this, by faith. And I have a feeling that birds and fish have they're derived from one another, and they are of one family. The fact that he's even using that phrase, birds and fish are one family, that's modern scientific lingo to mean like one clade, right? So, from a monophyletic pedigree sort of context. Now, Philip Schaff is like, oh my gosh, there's this history of conjecture and how do we understand this? And now, thanks to Darwin and thanks to the understandings of cladistics, fish does ultimately birds do come from fish. So that's what I'm getting at, where suddenly you have what in the Latin it's called sensus planoa, like an unveiling of something new, a new piece of interpretation information that clarifies that text, even though initially it may have been not fully understood. But at the same time, it wasn't theologically a problem, although people were mocking it without understanding.
Wait, let me get to it, because I've got a bunch of questions that have been coming in on Genesis that I want to just say all of them really quickly so we don't. But one of them is someone was asking about Adam and Eve having belly buttons, and I think Rob's opinion was that Adam and Eve might not have been the very first people, but they were the first ones to be recorded with
So yes,
God.
Adam and Eve did have belly buttons. Yeah.
So he would say they did have belly buttons. Then we have another thing about were dinosaurs there at Genesis where they mentioned, and then the third one is
except day 5. So again, from a concordance point of view, so if you're taking Cambrian explosion moving forward, yes, the bird-fish relationship, yes, dinosaurs would be in verse 21 because tannin is used there, meaning monster or dragon, and you could fit dinosaur in there. But that's before day 6, which is an epoch, obviously, and that's humans. So yeah, the chronology works like that.
Okay. And then I have Steve Rivard is saying, please ask Rob if the phrase death reigned from Adam to Moses equals no human had face-to-face communion with God from Adam until Moses, which is spiritual death.
Read verse 17. Because 17 does speak about, but death is going on with respect to, and also sin and all that was with respect to other people not connected to Adam. And then Paul very clearly, if you read Romans 5 carefully, he says Adam and Jesus have a typological relationship. He actually uses the word type there. Therefore, Adam is not, and for example, 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus is the second Adam, or Jesus is the last man. Is Jesus literally the last man? Because there's been a lot of men, after the 1st century AD. This is all typology in the Second Temple period. If you take it literally, which is what Ellen G. White did, and the reason why you have young creationism is because of that, then you just dishonor the text and you dishonor modern science, and on it goes.
And Pine Creek is wondering if Jesus from the 1st century accepted evolution via common descent. Do we have any evidence that Jesus was about evolution?
There's a subtle hint in Mark 10 where Jesus has the word beginning twice. So in the beginning of the creation, so beginning and creation. So to a Jew, Bereshit, beginning, right? Genesis 1:1. Creation is always to do with Bereshit anyway. He says, in the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. Hang on a second, Jesus. Are you saying Adam and Eve is in Genesis 1:1? And it's interesting that he doesn't name Adam and Eve there. And it's interesting that when you do read Second Temple literature, like, say, Enoch, the male and female do not correspond to that phrase doesn't correspond only to humans. It does correspond to additionally watery species that arise from the oceans. And guess what? Genesis 1 verse 2, when it says the Spirit was hovering over the waters, the word for hover means to incubate life. And it's interesting that you have church fathers like Ephraim the Syrian, stating that the Holy Spirit was incubating life to bring about ultimately the type of phyla you see in day 5, and that there was a male and female relationship going on from that period moving forward into this thing called man and woman, which is the Homo sapien. Augustine picks up on all that argumentation, and I have a lengthy quote that I can read where he's just like, yeah, this is just just a natural process. One thing leads to the next. And when you read that Augustinian quote, you can't help but go, this sounds suspiciously like natural history of evolution. And
I really quickly, I have to head off in a few moments. I wanted to ask Rob one last question about what he said before. So you bring up, the fish to the birds example in Genesis as an example of what was, perhaps a relationship between the Genesis story and actual natural history. So I'm curious, do you think the Bible is citing what was happening 5,000 years ago for that fish to birds example, or is it calling back to when that actually happened evolutionarily?
Yeah, I don't know where you're getting the 5,000 figure though. There's no time frame given. So the author is just recounting now again, this comes to the question of inspiration. So I'm saying ultimately Moses being the editor, and then you have editors after him, ultimately you can't tell me that these guys had a purely naturalistic sort of deduction of reality, because the sequence of events that you see there, especially with the conditions of early Earth versus later Earth, initially it's a water world and landmass appearing, and then all the way down to day 5, and boom, something that sounds like the Cambrian explosion, and then boom, humans on the scene. Like, that is so unique in the ancient Near Eastern literature. You don't see that. You don't see that chronology of events. It's in the Enuma Elish. You can just compare it. So, and you don't see this 5,000-year figure. You don't see that. All you do see is the only time you start to see a time frame given is in Genesis 5, the genealogy, which actually matches with what's called the Sumerian king list. But even then, it's base 60 numbers, not base 10 numbers that you and I are used to. Base 60 numbers have a symbolic usage. And so even then, you can't really put biblically, you can't put a time frame to when Adam and Eve existed. So all you can do then is take clues out of the text. And I'll end it with this. In Genesis 10, the Table of Nations before the Tower of Babel. So now we're getting pretty close. So the Tower of Babel we can put into maybe the Ur-3 period. So the Ur-3 dynasty. But in Genesis 10, there's a peculiar statement that says that the earth was divided. That goes along with what's known as the land bridges that were breaking apart during the last ice age, the ending of the last age. Now so from science, we can put that at like a 10,000-year mark. So basically Noah's flood would be maybe 13,000 years, and then Adam and Eve would be any time past that. We do know that migration from Africa into the Persian Gulf was 70,000 years ago. So now we could put Adam and Eve in the 70,000-year bracket, and then on you go with that. So I find it interesting that from an epoch sense, it's wise that the text doesn't give a timestamp, because time is not static. Time is dynamic. If Genesis had so many thousand years ago, this happened, well, as time progresses, that timestamp would be wrong from a future reader's point of view. It just gives you epochs, like this happened, then this happened. And then you and I are sort of going out of the way to put like a calendrical supplication on top of that.
Okay, well, I have to head off, but thank you everyone for having me. I appreciate being given the chance to speak. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, if you send me a link to your channel, or you say I can look it up by your name?
Yeah, I'll just type in the chat afterwards. And so you can check that out. But hopefully later on, SJ, you and I can have a conversation of some sorts. I hope I've been pleasant enough to earn that at least. But
yeah, you've been great.
Thank you for answering.
Christian, also just quickly before you go, in all my videos, you'll see me put my Google Drive link in the video description. Click that link, request access, and then it's the Sentinel resources, but then go specifically to my folder in that folder called Robert Studies. In that folder, you'll find all the stuff that I've been researching and writing and all that, and like just for your own curiosity, if you're interested.
Oh, awesome! I'll definitely take a look at that, and have a good rest of your day. And I will speak to you later.
Sweet.
Thanks. Somebody else had a question here, and I lost what. Oh, it was Pine Creek wants to know, Rob, do you know if there's any any historical events or anything in Genesis that have been proven false historically?
As far as I know, the attempts to try and, prove it false have fallen flat on its face. For example, Michael Shermer.
Sorry, Rob. I don't think he meant He meant, is there anything in there that's false? Like any one thing in there that's false? Just anything.
As far as I know, no.
No. So everything that's in there is true.
What I'm saying is, in 2009, up until 2009, there was a problem. And that problem was the vegetation mentioned in day 3. So that appears before any type of species that you see in day 5, right? So I remember Hugh Ross going out of his way to say, well, if you just go along with the Genesis 1 verse 2 claim that the Spirit hovers and incubates life, at least in that sense, you have life before vegetation. But then, even then, the vegetation described in day 3 is remarkably sophisticated. A paper came out in 2009 showcasing that there's vegetation that extends back to 1.9 billion years, which is well before the Cambrian. And lo and behold, chronologically, again, that aligns with the Genesis account. So up until 2009, Michael Shermer, in all his debates, was going out of his way, even to Ken Hovind. Like when you see Ken Hovind debate Michael Shermer, see, Genesis has got that wrong, That was a genuine problem until that paper came out showing isotopic evidence for flora, advanced flora, going pretty far back.
That's interesting. I'm going to have to find a link to that paper. That sounds like a good reference to have.
I mean, that's just one example. You have to give me an example, Pine Creek, Doug.
Rob's been, I guess Pine Creek said he asked the question a different way, and I'm not going back to what exactly
I think
he
I
said.
tried to clarify it in that way that was why I interrupt, because I think his point was, is there anything that's not true? So like, if it says, I think the point he's kind of making is, it might seem more reasonable to be like, well, this is true, and this is true, but obviously, like, Adam and Eve aren't made from dust of the ground or something like that. Like that would be for. I think that's what he's going for.
So wait, I'm reading it wrong. So if there is anything in Genesis that is incorrect historically, if you're gonna be very loose with that word, anything, then I would say yes. And here's what I mean. If you don't go the concordus approach, then yes. If you go with what's known as the temple inauguration perspective, if you go with an ancient Near Eastern cosmology, theologically it's actually perfect, because polemically it responds to the ancient Near Eastern perspective. But that is not wrong. I mean, that is not correct as far as we understand reality. There is no dome. The earth is not flat. There are no pillars. The mountains don't hold up the dome. Water is not above the dome. All those descriptions. So that's what I'm getting at with the layering of how the text can be applicable in the way you look at it. So if I read it as an ancient Near Eastern person, very familiar, very entrenched in my thinking of cosmology, which is the flat earth stuff, I'll be looking at this going, oh, not Tiamat and Marduk. It's Yahweh. That's the one that's taming Tiamat. Ooh, that's interesting. The spirit hovering over the waters. That's the Tiamat polemic. But then if I look at it from an ancient Israelite context with the nuances of the Hebrew and so on, John Sailhammer went out of his way to do exactly that. How would an ancient Israelite sort of like paraphrase the passage? I have the translation on my blog, and it reads exactly like a modern science textbook on, the natural history of the earth. And he goes out of his way to say, I'm not trying to fit this with science. I'm just going with the rules of Hebrew grammar. This is how it reads. So,
do you think, Rob, if I mean, let's say in 10 years' time we found out the Earth is flat and there is a firmament or something,
it would prove the Concordus reading wrong, but it would prove the ancient Near Eastern perspective right.
yeah, that's what I was saying. So say if scientifically we find that out in 10 years' time, do you think you'd be saying, yeah, all that stuff I said about how we interpret the Bible, that's wrong. We actually just interpret it like it says, like these fundamentalist kind of, like G-man types kind of come to it and say.
To be honest, if something as radical as that happened, I would have to question.
I'm not saying it's likely.
I've lost my sanity or something. Yeah. No, but I know what you mean. Because okay.
I guess my concern because I don't want it to be kind of like rhetorical is like how kind of ad hoc is this kind of, like it seems very convenient. Do you know, like that's the script. Yeah.
Sure. But okay, if it's ad hoc and convenient, that means that would be applicable to me and any other people, what Michael Hires would like to call the Middle Earth type folk, who conjure up their own private interpretation, like Zachariah Sitchin with the Ancient Aliens.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm also saying I'm suspicious of them as well. Like,
oh no, but I know you don't mean it that way to me, but I am going there to emphasize your point because it's a good point.
Right.
So Zachariah Sitchin. So this is a good thought experiment. Zachariah Sitchin was the first to come up with this stuff. I mean, there were sort of loose ends, what's called theosophy, meaning those weird 1800 venturing into that weird stuff. But Zachariah Sitchin was like, I guess you could say that the founding father of that stuff. Now, and Heises has said this himself. He said, look, if Zachariah Sitchin had an ancient grounding, meaning over a vast period of time, people were sort of on the right track, picking at it piece by piece, adding a little bit more details over time. And then finally, Zachariah Sitchin comes up with a novel idea. Then we'd have to take seriously what he's getting at. Obviously, that would include him actually correctly translating the Sumerian and all that stuff, right? The cuneiform. That's then applied to that example I gave Christian about Genesis 1:20 with the birds and the fish. If I'm the first in 2,000 years of church history saying, look, guys, I may be the first, but look, it looks like birds come from the oceans and therefore, boom, evolution. I would have to, if I'm going to be honest with the people who hear my argument, with my audience, I'll have to be honest and say, look, I'm the first to come up with this, and I don't know if I'm right. Now, why am I coming up with this? I've got 2,000 years worth of people saying the exact same thing, like what I've just mentioned. So therefore, how can it be ad hoc? And, it's my own private interpretation when people more intelligent than me were thinking the same thing, coming up with the same questions. And then you have in the 1800s sort of like an illumination, like, oh, actually now I think we've sort of like, we finally solved the question, birds coming from the oceans. Now it seems to work from a natural, now that science is able to explain that, if the text is indeed recording accurate natural history.
Let me just interject here. Wes is now in here, and I don't know if this Wes is Jesse Camping, but I want to say welcome to Wes, who just joined us.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Hi, Jesse.
Yeah,
so Jesse was just in the audience, so now we've got. Now it's 3 Christians versus. No, I'm just kidding.
You see, Pine Creek just said, what Rob and Huros do is accept the science, then retrofit it into the Bible to make it fit.
I'd like to kind of come back
I'm not
on.
saying that.
I'd like to. So on what you just said there, Rob, where you said, we've got this long line of people who are on the right track, but it seems like I'm not sure that you have an answer to kind of how we could say if they were on the wrong track, because it seems to me whenever there is something that's wrong, either it is ignored or kind of rationalized. So it's like, because it's not quite. I mean, it's a compelling narrative, but I don't think it's quite as clear cut as like this long line of people who are just of Christian scholars and great thinkers who were on the right. I think there's also like, well,
wait. They were on the right track because we do know for a fact that birds are dinosaurs and dinosaurs do. I'm not
saying that there weren't some people who thought that, but then there are also Christian scholars who thought things that are patently false as well. And it's like we're kind of only seeing the ones that align with the narrative we want, but ignoring where it's wrong. And that would be my concern.
Sure. But that applies to everyone, even today, scientists who clearly show that birds do come from fish, they themselves have made a lot of mistakes and errors, and it comes down to hermeneutic and interpretation. Here you have a text. The hypothesis is it's inerrant, it's error-free. And then that itself needs to be nuanced, because I can punch holes and say, no, it's not error-free, because look, it matches ancient Near Eastern cosmology, and we know ancient Near Eastern cosmology is wrong. But then the ancient Near Eastern scholar will say, no, but that still means it's error-free because it's accurately showing ancient Near Eastern cosmology in a polemical theological context. So therefore you can't, set up a straw man and discount the Genesis narrative with your scientific lens and say it's got it wrong, when really its intent was to respond to that.
If it was wrong, how would you like? I mean, this is completely hypothetical, I think, and I don't mean it in a leading way. But if the Bible were not true, but or not the Bible, like there's some ancient religious document that comes from a certain area, and it it approximately aligns with some things we know historically, and we know it comes from the area and so forth, but it isn't actually true. How could we discern that on your view? It seems to me like that quote not true in terms of corresponding to reality way of looking at the world could be sort of brought into a compelling narrative where we say, well, when we look at it from their perspective, it makes sense, or there's this person and this person, they were on the right lines, and we start kind of connecting the dots in that way. But it isn't necessarily it doesn't take into account the fact that it just isn't that document isn't inspired by. And this is in the hypothetical world. I'm not saying that the Bible isn't inspired or whatever, but I'm saying if we had a religious text that wasn't inspired, how could we? I need to make the question more direct, maybe, to not get confused.
Stupid Energy says Nathan has a PhD in fine Greek. So
can I step in?
No, wait. Can I think Nathan's, again, it's very important what Nathan's getting at. Just to, if I answer it this way, tell me if I understood your question if I answer it this way. So
sure.
Depending on how I understand your question, so this is how I respond. If we don't know, or if it appears to be contradictory with, say, natural history, or if like, for example, the vegetation thing that Michael Shermer kept using. So there's an obvious chronological issue there. If I went out of my way to say, no, Genesis is still accurate, 100% in the concordant sense, I'm being dishonest to an actual legitimate argument Michael Shermer is giving until that 2009 paper. So what I would have to do is I'd be like, actually, Shermer, everything is more or less actually accurate, except there is, obviously, you do have a point. There is an issue chronologically there. You're still working on it. So that's scientific humility. Like, if you don't know, you don't just go out of your way and make blind faith statements. maybe that's what Pine Creek's getting at. Like, is there anything historically invalid?
Yeah,
There are still questions in the text, yeah, in that sense.
And I think I agree with that too. I want to say,
am I close?
Let me bring...
Did I understand your question in that sense?
A little bit. I guess it's what I'd want, maybe like a clearer criterion, because it seems to me if we can't distinguish clearly what it would look like if we had, because it seems logically possible to me that say an ancient culture produces a religious text, and it's ambiguous enough but aligns enough to reality that like me as a modern reader, I could go either way. Like I could either be like, well, when I look at the context, it makes sense and they were onto something, and I've just got my cultural lens, which is a bit different, or it was just false. But I want some kind of criterion that would allow us to say that it's false as well as true, rather than just kind of be like, it seems at the minute that the only option that's available is it's true with with explanations and reasons given, and going into which I agree is right, going into the nuance. Sorry, SJ.
No, I was gonna say, let me let Wes step in here, because he wanted to offer something, and Wes is kind of new. He's been in my chats before, but he's here now. So
I just want to go back to Genesis. Nobody's really brought up the real theological view of it, just to bring it into maybe a perspective that mankind, and watching how it decides to go its own way and gets kicked out of the garden. Like, just looking at that thing, maybe even the talking snake doesn't have to be a talking snake. Maybe it can be like a shoulder angel saying, hey, should we do this? Should we do this? We'll go our own way. And they reject God. So they're heading out of the garden now, by God's, doing. But this is the important part to me, to the text, is this fall. And I think looking at it and going into all these details, you're really losing the story. And that's really only thing I wanted to say. Then it moves on, of course, to Abraham and his, he leaves the civilization as to say there's just one God. So, and goes on his own. So that's all I really wanted to say. So to me, going this deep into it is a separate side of the whole text, just to see where it lays out. I look at it as prehistory, before we had time, and I look at it as a theological text more than anything. And I think that's maybe a more important way to look at it, just to look at the fall.
I think Nathan, to give more of like a scientific analogy, take general relativity. Are you saying, imagine if we were like Doc with our DeLorean, we go back in time to when Einstein was writing up his special theory that then led into his general. But now, because of quantum electrodynamics and all that's taken place with Richard Feynman, and on it goes, we can go back in time already, but it's sort of like a primer, like a systematic primer. But let's pretend that when we go back in time, our memory is completely wiped, like in the sense of all this background knowledge of science, right? So meaning we're starting with a fresh, clean slate, sort of like in the moment, living in the moment with Einstein discovering for the first time, writing the formulas, all that. And it's, there's this anticipation, okay, as the theory is building. And oops, oh, there's the eclipse. Let's see if it works. The famous eclipse that took place to verify if the theory is right or not. Now, imagine if you had like a document from the future that sort of laid out the maths accurately, and it followed chronologically the build-up. That would come across as remarkably prophetic and religious, or supernatural in some sense. Why? Because of this thing called hindsight. And so that's what a lot of not only theologians but recently when I interviewed Jeffrey Rose, the anthropologist in the Persian Gulf, his latest book that he's going to release now is going to be published later this year. He's been at this for about 20 years now, human migration in the Persian. He's just spooked. Look, here's a text. It's a culture that is localized in a like what Carl Sagan would say, like a fraction of a pixel on this thing called the blue dot in this vast cosmic scene. And here they had insights and just a way of life and the way they think about things and human value and worth and so on. That is just so vast that it's near timeless in the way it can be then applied to future generations. The New Testament authors would say that this is the hand of God in that providential process of compiling this as a book of God, so to speak. But then at the same time, they'd also say, look, it's not just the Bible. There's also this thing called the Book of Nature. So like the creedal statements actually go out of its way to say, look to the Book of Nature, because the Book of Nature in itself has millions of pages to derive from to verify that these two books work. I sympathize with you or Pine Creek, the skepticism that you both have, because it does come out to be too good to be true. Because what about things like the Quran or the Hindu Vedas or any of the other quote unquote holy texts? Because
we can do the same with them. I think that's the issue is, and I think
people in those traditions, obviously, now this is where bias comes in. They'll be like, oh, maybe I'm a Muslim, maybe the Quran does the same thing, and Muslims do that. Speed of light's calculated in the Quran. Like you've seen those claims. All I have to, since I'm aware of that, all I have to do is go, look, there's a type of concordism that they're approaching, and there's a type of concordism I'm approaching. I don't go into those bizarre, like, speed of light's been proven type concordism. And when I analyze their claims are ad hoc, big time, because you don't have what's called the tafsir. The tafsir is a commentary on the Quran. You don't have the tafsir or the hadith that give that build-up of interpretation that then finally is clarified, like, for example, the birdfish thing I was telling you about. You don't have any of the imams, this is an interesting verse in the Quran. And the famous Islamic saying, Allah knows best, because in the moment we don't know, and so maybe Allah knows best, and so maybe later on we'll know. They don't go through that process. It's only now because of science that's contradicting the flat Earth's cosmology of the Quran are Muslims, doing ad hoc. So,
but if we were to take like a random kind of sample of Christian apologists and scholars and Muslim apologists and scholars, I mean, you're very much in the minority with your approach. And I think we would see probably with the vast majority of these Christian scholars and the vast majority of these Muslim scholars, this approach that I think we're both critical of in certain ways, but then we could probably also find outliers within Islam who approach Islam very much the same way you do Christianity. And certainly within Hinduism, I'm aware of, it's very complex and nuanced, like all the history and stuff. But there are people who approach Hinduism or Buddhism in as nuanced and as historically, it has the kind of historical lineage that it can point back and say, look, we've got this continuity of narrative. And but it seems to me, even though you might accept that, you might say, well, these people have some kind of connection to divinity in some way. You might deny that as well, and they might say the same as you. But it seems that you are fundamentally disagreeing with each other at some level. And I'm saying, so for me then, as an observer who can see this, I can see you've got, like as far as people who are open to ideas and looking at and trying not to do the kind of ad hoc thing as much as possible, there's this plausible explanation for Christianity, but then there's also like a naturalist explanation that can make sense of that in as plausible a way as well on some level. And it's like, how would I actually tell the difference if we take this kind of approach to a historical, is it Lao Shu with the turtle that comes out on with like a magic square of numbers on its back or something, and their creation myth is something to do with that. And because none of us are kind of emotionally invested in that, it's not going to seem like I'm kind of insulting you if I talk about that example or something. Like there could be someone who's from that kind of heritage of religions and cultural traditions who's like, they didn't mean it literally that that the turtle created everything or whatever. It's kind of this metaphorical truth, and you can see from the way the numbers are, and you've got the way that numbers work in the world. It's a compelling narrative. It's plausible to them. It makes sense, but we're going to think it's false. And it's like, how do we? Well, I think we're gonna think it's false though. How can we actually tell the difference between when these things are tethered to like a divine or a thing that seems kind of implausible to our everyday experience, perhaps, and when it is tethered to that?
I want to look at that for a second, because I'm looking at, and I know that Rob has read this book too, but if you go in and you read Michael Heiser's books on Unseen Realm, and you read some of his other books on angels, and I'm reading Demons right now, and I've got 2 other books of his besides those, like Enoch and another one waiting to go. But one of the things that he points out from Psalm 82 that really rang true with me for a major reason is he points out the fact that in Psalm 82, God calls his divine counsel. He points out Deuteronomy 32 and Genesis 6 and the Tower of Babel, when God disinherits the nations and basically assigns the gods, the sons of God, to these other nations. And so he's considered the Most High, but these spiritual beings are basically put in authority at that point until Jesus came back and the Pentecost went out and reclaimed the nations. But my point is that there still is a divine level of divinity in spiritual beings in these other places, influencing these other religions. And we saw it in ancient times, and we still see it now in some of these places. And that helps to explain to me things like what I saw in India. I have a friend who's Indian, who's a Hindu, and he's brought me pictures of things of people levitating. A person literally sitting 4 feet off the ground. Nobody knows how this is even possible. And different things like that aren't just plays on pictures. He physically saw that. And I think to myself, how is that possible if their God, I think that there's some level of truth to these other beings that are not considered the Most High. And so that's kind of how I explain some of the things that I've seen in other cultures.
I mean, the thing is, though, is as you say those things, SJ, I think it's a much simpler explanation, for example, for me, that guy's levitating and it is some kind of trick. Maybe there's like a pole that goes up his sleeve behind him. So, I'm not saying but it seems to me that is more simple, but also that your friend who was there and took the picture was fooled by the trick. And that seems to me way more simple than like saying there's actually like a demon in this realm of council, and did it like putting all these extra entities in there that are really far outside of my like experience of reality. I don't experience any of those things. So then to say, well, actually this is what's going on, and like to add all these things in that I don't have much warrant to say exist, becomes like quite an unplausible way.
No, I agree. I go for the naturalistic explanation first. Absolutely. Because, if there is one, we want that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm from India, so the earliest memory I have was when I was 5. I'm not making this up. I left India when I was 9, and I'm a European. It's what you call an Anglo-Indian. So it's like a European family during World War I and II that lived there, and I was born in Hyderabad, India, and I find it interesting now in hindsight that basically India and all the Eastern cultures, they don't even go out of their way to ask questions, these epistemic questions of atheist, theist. Are you an atheist? Are you a theist? Hey, let me prove to you, divinity. And it's just a given that weird stuff happens. Now, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with what SJ is getting, but from my experience, for example, there's 4 festivals that takes place. It's designed for the main gods. there was one particular festival to Shiva and Kali, destruction and death. And the festival, they usually do festivals like on the street. So like Holi, for example, the colored powder they throw on people. So this one was describing, this one was about if you have any, your karma, if you have any physical ailments or you have any karma that you need to let go of and so on, you get washed with this white powder and then it falls off onto the ground. And so the next morning, my mom was taking me to the markets and I had an Indian friend with me. And we were told not to, and there's all these patches of powder everywhere on the road. And we were told not to touch, like mom being very superstitious. And I'm 5, why? It's just, it's just sand on the ground. But yeah, there's a superstition. Don't touch that. And even the Indians have this superstition. Don't go into that temple or don't do this or don't, even in the forest regions and so on. So, but my friend, my school friend and I, we challenged each other. Okay, let's try and hop over this mound of white powder. And we both landed in it. Now, the first thing that was going through my mind was, I'm going to get into trouble because mom's going to see the white powder on my shin and that's it. Within 2-3 seconds, I had no idea what was going on. Now I know medically what was going on, but I was getting, not only was I, mom's going to kill me, but I got even more freaked out with what was happening to my friend. He immediately was having a seizure, blood coming out of his nose, eyes rolled back, but he was speaking in a mixture of Telugu with Hindi, the native languages of the region. That was really freaky. He was spasming and all that, and he was just uttering these Hindu words. For 2 hours, he was coming in and out of that seizure. And finally, the only way that he could be healed from that, so to speak, they didn't, and that's another thing. When we try to take him to a doctor, or we had try and get a doctor to come to the location, and they don't want to deal with that sort of thing. Ultimately, it also costs too much money. So don't forget, they don't really have the resources for that sort of thing. So the only solution was to go to St. John's Church down the road. Not even any of the Hindu priests were interested. And here's another thing. This tackles the whole denominational question. My parents are Protestant. This is a Catholic church. So we go to a Catholic church. You'd think, Protestant church would be better, right? But we go to a Catholic church and the Catholic priest did an exorcism on him. And then within 5 minutes, he was all right. And from that day on, he was fine. Now, but I remember that so clearly that coming to Australia, everything looks so sterile in comparison to what goes on the streets there and just the way of life and how they think. And, I have Indonesian friends here in Perth who tell me the most ridiculous things that you and I, James Randi would have a field day in any of those Asian countries with this sort of thing. But this stuff actually does happen. It's weird. And it's not explainable with.
But it depends what you mean by this stuff does actually happen, because I 100% believe that that events happen and people experience them in ways where it gets attributed to, for example, demonic possession and stuff like that. But I do think that I mean I've not come across any where in the cold light of day there isn't a kind of naturalistic explanation that makes more sense to me.
But just the timing of everything. Why now? I guess what you would say is maybe something was in the powder.
Yeah,
that
I think
caused a natural allergic reaction of some kind. But then
the fact that priests could exercise it, I'd have to believe that. I mean, I look for naturalistic explanations, but you have to make connections. If you have these kind of stories, you have to take them seriously and say, well, there could be a supernatural explanation here.
Well, I suppose there's two follow-up questions then to that, SJ, and the first one I don't mean this in like a silly way, but would you want your doctor to have those same kind of assumptions if you were having a seizure?
Well, I wouldn't say that all seizures are. There are some people who are born with epilepsy, and that's just another reason why we see the seizures, which is a physical thing, and then they're treated with medicine, and so that's not the same thing as far as what I see, what Rob was conveying.
But what I mean is, like, if you or someone who's like in your care was having a seizure and you took them to the doctor, is there a point in that medical process you'd want them to assume it was demonic possession and not kind of
the interesting thing is the first thing that, now, if I was to put, say, my first century lens on, like how a Jew would respond to, like a religious Jew, they would say, go to the doctor. The physician is Yahweh's providence. We tried to go to a doctor, but in the moment, there was no means for a doctor to come or to go to. So that's a hypothetical I'm going to be intellectually honest and say, I would love to see what would have happened. Maybe a type of medication would have helped. So what I'm saying is, and that's a good observation, because then notice that people who take the extreme of what I just said, like, the biting snakes thing and, healing, like charismatics. Yeah, that's when it becomes ridiculous. No. Go to the physician, try and get it sorted. The point is, what did happen, and as Esther noticed, it was just a priest, no medical history or application. It was just through prayer that whatever this entity that was in him, if there was, it left. Now, Heiser then has dedicated a whole podcast series called Paranormal. So it's paranormal, but peer-reviewed, where this sort of thing is actually quite rampant in the research that also overlaps with the medical field as well. Since Pine Creek's in the chat, there's a video I made, a compilation, where he interviewed Laura Robinson and the other guy that run the New Testament Review.
Ian Mill.
Ian. There's a section in that debate, or not debate, interview, where Ian actually said exactly what you said about how, when it comes to things like demonic possession and so on, you don't want your you don't want your country or your state or your practice, medical practice, to just rely on priests in a church or something.
Yeah,
I'm paraphrasing what he said, but that clip, I then had a response by a medical professional who, ironically, not being religious, actually found it beneficial for this quasi-supernatural religious sort of integration into not only his field, but many of his colleagues. That video, I recommend you and Pine Creek to watch, because I actually mashed it into that. I think it's... I'll get the link and I'll put it in the chat. Yeah.
So like when you're talking, for example, about the priest doing the exorcism and it works. So there's lots of what would seem to me to be more kind of plausible explanations of what's going on there before I'd go to intervention or divine intervention of some sort that caused that. And I actually think something like I mean, this is kind of, I think religion works on naturalism to a degree, and I think that prayer on naturalism makes sense. Like, you're with this would just be kind of like petitionary parent things, like people in the community talking about things in their life. They're bringing them to the front of their consciousness, but in the community as well. So it's going to go into other people's minds. They're going to think about problems people have and so forth. But I think there's probably like medically, we're not sort of computational robots, and having some kind of like prayer or meditation or mindfulness, whatever we want to cause it, is going to like increase people's well-being in like therapeutic situations and settings. But I would say that that's like supporting evidence for then when we go into like a religious setting and we see that people are reporting the effects of prayer and stuff, that it's actually just whatever this kind of this accounted for effect is, or some kind of flavor of that's going on. I would think before I jump to it's like divine intervention, I'd say that like there'd have to be all these other things would have to be knocked off before I could like say it's that's the one that makes more sense than all of these others.
So we should probably wrap it up in the next 10 minutes or so, just to point that out. But go ahead.
Yeah, ultimately all I would say is, look, a couple of things. Like maybe I don't know how many bullet points to make, but I'll try and keep it as short. So all I say is there is legitimate peer-reviewed scholarship in regards to the paranormal. First century Christians and Jews, and basically anyone who's sympathetic to actually, this sounds judgmental, but using your mind and not just being all sensational with the feelings and so on, they will say, from their religious worldview, Yahweh and the other gods and this thing called heaven and earth, there's no dichotomy. It's actually a blend of the two, which means anything that is quote unquote demonic is ironically, and this is their wording, natural. Not this notion of supernatural is because the dichotomy between the two, and hence it causes these problems like you're describing. So that's how they would also pass the language, and then it really comes down to that. If God does exist, as I was arguing to Christian, the most explicit example would be the incarnation of the Logos. That's it. I can't think of any other means for him to do that, unless maybe you're talking about the weird stuff like human chromosome 2 or the Big Bang itself. But then again, those things are God of the gaps. Yeah. So at the end of the day, the Christian message of the incarnation to me makes the most rational sense if we're going to defend the existence of God.
I do. Sorry, SJ, you go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say thanks to I am Pazuzu. And I think that's some sort of a spiritual being or something like that. So, I don't know.
It's from a horror film, I think.
So that's from Sarah. So thank you, Sarah.
By the way, SJ, I put the link in the chat. If people outside in the outside chat want to see the video I made on that.
Oh, perfect. Good. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, in the Zoom chat, I put it, so you'll have to copy and put that into the other chat.
I will.
Yeah.
Good.
I'd agree with you on that point about the incarnation. It's certainly something that would make Christianity different from a lot of religions. Perhaps not all. Perhaps not. Like if you look at Hinduism, for example. But I do think though there is a difference between the type of evidence that I have today available to me about that event and the type of evidence that the alleged authors of some of these texts would have had. So they would have, they would, if they genuinely before their eyes had this particular experience, I think, okay, they've got justification. That I think it's possible they could have formed false beliefs as well, but they would have had justification for their beliefs. But then for me now, for the level, I don't have that same level of evidence that they've got. I've got texts of their testimonies, and then there's. But we've got like a multiplication of like things we've got to think about and different probabilities going on and stuff to consider.
Well, I would say, Nathan, I would actually agree and actually honor your skepticism, because technically that's what we should be doing, as what Paul calls the Bereans in Acts 17. Search the scriptures, see if it's, Acts 17:11. Like, and this is not to be one up over you. It's just from my walk and research and sort of like perspective. And again, if we go down the solipsis road, right, I could be completely deluded. The point is, from what I see with the data, the whole question of John 1:40 and John 1:18 in the incarnation, that just wraps up all of these questions. What you're saying is, look, I get what you're saying, Rob, but for me right now, I'm still not convinced because I still have homework to do. And the thing is, we all do. We all still have homework to do, even me. But from my homework studies so far, I'm at that point where I'm just like, look, this is a bit too on the nose to not be supernatural or not have God involved. So even though you do maintain that skepticism, I'm not going to go out of my way to judge that, because, to be honest, I think, ironically, you're demonstrating a Christian virtue by that, because that's scientific humility, which is what Christians were always about, because they were the ones that removed superstition from the Greco-Roman religions and so on. So, anyway.
So I want to say hi to Bruce, who just joined us. Bruce, I haven't met you before, so kind of you just coming on in here to the Lion's Den. So how are you?
Oh, he's muted. You're muted.
Oh, you're muted.
I see. Oh, glad to meet you. Thank you. Yeah, looks interesting. Yeah,
All right, well, welcome.
Before I changed my channel name, and anyhow, just looking around, seeing what's happening.
Good.
I just want to, SJ, before you close it, quickly, a few seconds. Nathan, what I just said about my honor of your skepticism, I hope I didn't. Was I rude in any way, or did I?
No, you weren't. You weren't rude in any way. I guess.
Okay.
The only thing I would have thought, like when you kind of said, you've got your homework to do or something. It felt a little bit like, but maybe in there.
That's why I didn't want to.
It's like, oh, you'll come to truth eventually, and I know.
I don't mean it like that at all. Yeah.
I know you're not intending it like that, but I guess I see what you're saying, but because I don't have that complete knowledge, I can't say whether the homework actually leads to saying Christianity is true at the end.
Sure.
And it might well not,
Yeah. So that's why I'm caveating that by saying, look, to the Christians out there, I think Nathan is demonstrating what Christians should be doing, even though you do hold to this thing called the faith tradition and so on. It's a good thing. Romans 12 principle again: renew your mind. Offer your body as a living sacrifice. Like it's not a, when Christians, like, Reformed people, like with the whole presupposition, that requires a level of omniscience that you don't have. You're not being honest with yourself.
Well, that's why when I spoke to Darth Dawkins, I said I was omniscient, and he didn't.
Yeah.
So I want to ask Bruce here. Bruce, are you a Christian, or are you the one who was in the chat that said, "Ask me about Satan"?
Yeah, that is me. I actually did it. Yeah. I did have a channel for a while, and it was Ask Me About Jesus, but I didn't get much attention. So actually, I changed it yesterday, and it does seem to be doing better, I have to admit. I mean, as far as people wanting to ask or tell you something, it's just interesting. It's just kind of my own personal study, I guess, just to see what the difference is,
Yeah, no, that's good. So I'll get links to everybody's channels. If you guys put the links, just share with me the link at some point, like in the comments, if I don't have it yet. I've already got links to Robert's and Nathan's, for example, but I also, and Jesse Camping's, but I want to get yours too.
Yeah, I can. The only thing I'd say is, what I used to do was like a number of years ago, if I got more than 50 subs, I would just shut it down and start over again. And then in the last year or so, I left it run up to like 190 something, which is probably not good because it's usually pretty controversial. I just said hello there, so hopefully that. Oh, that's right. You need a link.
You can just do it in the comments if you do it.
Okay. I don't usually. I'll give it to you. I don't usually advertise it. It's usually just a massive arguing about Christians, some Christians who act up and I don't know, they just attack people. It's just a weird thing that has been, I've only ever seen it really on YouTube or the internet, I could say. I don't really see it in general everyday life. I'm not saying Christians are, I don't know.
No, I think I've seen people act out in bad ways from all groups, unfortunately. I think it's exacerbated on the internet. I think we see the worst of some people on the internet, which is terrible.
Yeah, I don't know. It's almost like to some people, I think it's a God badge kind of thing where then they feel they have a right to go out and condemn everyone. And And then if I would bring up verses on, I know there was some talk earlier on, I guess it was some Calvinistic ideas of Reformed and such, or maybe I was misunderstanding what some of the discussion was earlier. But there's an idea with some people that you can even live in sin. That's an amazing thing to me, that, and then some people just kind of act like whatever, they just, I don't know, I think they get a high on it. Anyhow, it keeps my interest. So that's why I guess I don't really promote my channel.
No, that's good. That's interesting. So, well, anyway, we were kind of getting towards the end and we were just sort of wrapping this up, but it's been a really interesting, pretty deep conversation today. I learned a lot about a lot of things. And I don't know, Nathan, were we able to convert you? Because you said that Pine Creek needed to get in here and you were about to be converted. Did it happen?
Oh, that was just, that, I mean, to be honest, I am, my initial main concern of kind of like that I could also see myself putting together a compelling narrative in the same sort of way for the naturalist side of some of these facts, and how can I actually distinguish between which one. I still can't quite see that one. I don't know what it would, I mean, honestly, I don't know what it would take to kind of reconvert me or whatever at this point, but I don't know that it's, I don't think it's facts and things. I think actually what everyone does on every side is come to a conclusion and then find reasons afterwards. Like, I think that's what everyone is doing. So.
I think I'll admit that I'm a presupposition. I have a presupposition that God exists, and so then I kind of build everything off that. I want to quickly say thank you to Digital Hammurabi, who did a super chat, and I had actually opened this up
Josh.
and tried to get a lot of people in here. So I'm going to try to do this every Wednesday if I can. And so if anyone wants to come in, I'll have free-for-alls, try to go a couple hours and have exciting chats about interesting topics. I think today was very interesting and deep, and so I liked it. So thank you to everybody on here.
Could I ask a question before you stop?
Yeah.
I noticed a while back, and that's part of what I came in to see what was all going on. You were talking a bit about, I think, Nephilim and that kind of thing, and I think guy's Heiser's name came up, and then the Book of Enoch and that kind of thing. And I just wondered like what your thoughts were on that. You don't have to answer me now, but I am interested in it though.
Are you looking for mine or Rob's? Because I think Rob might have a more developed thought on that. I'm in the middle of reading a lot of this stuff.
I know that there's people who think that the Nephilim, or possibly here, or offshoots of the Nephilim, that some people, like they might have 6 fingers or whatever, and that they're walking the streets. I mean, they're actually.
I don't think they're around anymore. I think they were killed off, but.
Josh is going to like this. I'm going to be releasing a video soon called The Dark Supernatural History of the Nephilim, and it's going to tackle polydactylism, the extra digit stuff, in light of the genetics of that. I'm not going down the concordus route. It's kind of like a tongue. Josh and I, there's a tongue-in-cheek thing going on. So it's in fact, Nathan, I think, so in light of everything we've discussed, I think even that video will hopefully give you a perspective of what I'm getting with that homework thing.
Sure.
It'll like raise an eyebrow where you'll be like, ooh,
okay.
that is interesting.
In like a New Living Translation vernacular. What do you mean? No, I mean like.
No. What I'm saying is that these are all models at the end of the day. These are all models that what model fits reality the best? Is it the Islamic model,
the reality
Christian
of the
model,
Bible, or the reality of what? I mean, in other words, are there Nephilim possibly walking the streets today? Because I've heard people say there are.
I'm amalgamating the best of natural science with the best of biblical scholarship to make a coherent argument from what I'm finding.
I mean, I just asked
reasonable.
Well, it's okay. I mean, I just asked a simple question. I mean, what's your thought on that?
I can say I do not think there are Nephilim walking the street today. There's.
Okay.
Oh no, yeah, no. I'm not saying that at all. No.
Well, yeah, because I couldn't get at what you were saying. I mean, I just because I think it was passed over to you, and then I'm not really getting.
I'm talking about. Okay, there's a little bit of a spoiler, but for example, the whole Legion stuff that you see in the New Testament, Nathan, like if that's legit in the story, and then if you're able to legitimately trace it back to this thing called Nephilim Watcher spirits, the disembodied. It comes back to the principle about
the Watcher spirits wouldn't even be known unless you went into like the Sumerian texts and such. Or am I wrong on that?
I'm not going to spoil. It's all interconnected. Bible, or because I know SJ needs to.
Well, I mean, if we're going to get serious, I'm just saying the Watchers aren't in the Bible, right?
Yes, in Daniel 4, Watchers are mentioned.
Okay, the Watchers are in the Bible. Okay, well, see, there. I never studied it. I never liked it because people would get off on the Book of Enoch.
But Watchers are not Nephilim.
What's that?
Watchers are not Nephilim, though.
Okay, well, I guess, but they would take it back to the Sumerian text and somehow tie it together.
There's a Babylonian link to what's called the Akala myth and all that. Yeah.
That's what the Watchers.
Yeah.
I just know that in the Anunnaki, that kind of thing, and then they're claiming to be Christians, but they're afraid that certain people are Nephilim spirits or that kind of thing. They're hybrids.
Yes. Yeah.
Pretty bizarre and scary because they're not human anymore.
Okay.
They don't need to be seen as humans. And so therefore, I think it's dangerous when you don't see human beings as humans.
Okay, so I really apologize, Bruce. I just wanted to say this to Nathan. So Nathan,
all right, hey, take care.
Whether
thank you.
Because I know Stephanie closes. So Nathan, my challenge to you would be John 1:14 and 8 John chapter 1 verse 14 and verse 18. Those two verses.
Okay.
Have that as a hypothesis, sort of like title statement. Just read those two verses in your own time. Have that as like a title. Then just go through the whole Bible and see if, even just again, like what SJ is saying, have a pre-sub sort of perspective of God and see how this thread plays out, if there's a coherence. And then come back to me and be like, are these authors just their educated guesswork is so on point that you can make up like a conspiracy that they've all compiled in a moment?
Yeah, this is it
the
genuine? Go to your local Mormon church and hear about hear the good news of Moroni and
but
see if you can find a coherent thread.
Has nothing to do.
It's a coherent.
Yeah. But this is a hypothetical sort of challenge to you, and it is valid. In fact, you could ask me to do that Mormon challenge, right? What I will say is, I already know, but I could still do it for the sake of doing it.
But you see how I already know. Like I'm struggling with my I already know kind of like. Do you get what I mean? Like
But I could.
Sorry.
It'd be very quick for me to then go, nope, this is rubbish. So say it takes 10 weeks for you to do the homework challenge I'm giving you. It would take probably a week or two for me to go. That would be enough time for me to go. Mormonism is rubbish. That's what I'm getting at. So it's taken me much longer time with this question I'm asking you to process that question out than it would when I process Mormonism, Islam, and so on. And this question I'm asking you is what convinced me.
Okay.
No, that's great. I want to say thank you guys. I have to say, I do know that Rob does his homework. He sent me something with like 80 pages of references when he was looking into the book of Daniel. And then he also sent me something that's over 300 pages on the book of Revelation. And so I haven't read it yet. I have to admit, I'm looking forward to reading that. And so he definitely does a deep dive into things. And I know Nathan does too.
That commentary will give you an insight into what I've compiled all the Bible in that one commentary on Revelation. So yeah.
Really? Oh gosh, I got to get and read that. So you should put that into a book, Rob.
It's
Seriously.
a synthesis of all the scholarship, and I blend science, natural science into it.
Yeah, make a book out of it.
First century, Second Temple Jewish. Yeah. Anyway.
Good. Well, awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I want to say thanks, everybody in the chat, also for coming in here today. We're going to try to do this every week if possible. And you guys are always welcome to come in here. Rob's kind of funny. I know, Nathan, it's very late at night right now. I think, what is it, 11:26 there?
It is, yeah. So I'm going to go to bed now.
And Rob, it's very early in the morning.
For me. Yeah, I like Pine Creek's comment about me being a Scientologist. That's being pompous on his part, right? Very presumptuous. So
waste a lot of time studying it. I like this little rivalry going.
I still love you, Doug.
Between you and Doug, and then this other thing with Digital Hammurabi is very funny. So, well, thank you guys. I'm going to go ahead and end this. Appreciate it, and I will put links to everybody's stuff.
Thanks, SJ. See you.
Thanks.